is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster.
Just gone 10. Hello, good morning. Welcome to the show. This is Swarbrick on Sunday, live here on LBC. I'm Tom Swarbrick. Hope we find you very well this morning. Coming up in an hour's time, the first live interview of Sir Mark Sedwill, the former National Security Advisor, former head of the Civil Service, on this programme this morning to talk about the US, about Trump, and of course, managing the coronavirus crisis, the biggest challenge for any government in peacetime. Sir Mark Sedwill joining us live at 11 o'clock. We'll be joined by the Cabinet Minister Brandon Lewis in the next half hour, by Labour's Rosena Allin-Khan as well. Plus, what is going on in Wales? Have they completely lost their minds by deeming children's clothes and books and kitchenware in supermarkets as non-essential and wrapping them all up in plastic? What is the scientific basis for that? We'll discuss.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC.
Very good morning to you. This week, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, dipped his hand into his pocket again to try and offer greater protection for the economy, providing grants for businesses in Tier 2 and extra support for bosses to help keep paying wages. This is support that is definitely needed to stave off an unemployment explosion, to keep people with food on the table, as restrictions to deal with coronavirus absolutely smash up the economy. And as a result, we are now on for borrowing nearly £1 billion a day. Rishi Sunak has already spent £200 billion in the last few months, and there is, I'm afraid, no end to that in sight. We now have more debt than we have money coming in as a country, and at some stage, someone, somewhere, somehow, is going to have to start paying all of this back. 0345 6060 973 is my number. This morning it's reported that the Chancellor is looking to publish figures about the economic cost of lockdown. I wonder if you care at all, actually, how much this is all costing, whether you think it is even morally right to start taking finances into account here when what we're doing is trying to protect people's lives. Should the government say no to certain measures that the scientists want on the basis that it is the economists who are saying, listen, it's just too expensive now? 0345 6060 973. There are reports in some of the papers this morning suggesting that the Chancellor has gone around telling cabinet ministers that he is not going to pay for another national lockdown. And I wonder how much longer we can keep paying for all of this. I want to hear from you if you run a business, if you are trying to find a way through all this, how long you think you can be on that support for, how long that support is needed, and who is going to ultimately help pay it back. 0345 6060 973. We'll speak to a real life dragon, Theo Paphitis, in a few moments' time. We'll be joined by Ian McCafferty of the Bank of England, formerly of the Bank of England, in just a few moments as well. I want to speak to Sir Martin Sorrell, founder and executive chairman of S4 Capital, founder of WPP, the world's largest advertising and PR group. Sir Martin Sorrell, thank you for joining the programme. I wonder what you make of the measures that the Chancellor has announced thus far.
Well, I'm sympathetic to it. I don't think you can criticise the intention. The question really, Tom, is that he's trying to provide a bridge, I guess, until we get to a vaccine or until we get to spring of 2021 or the summer. I mean, temperatures obviously have fallen. The virus has become more virulent. It's interesting. Western Europe, it may be more virulent, but the death rate, put it grimly, the mortality rate is low. We go to Eastern Europe and it's the opposite. America seems to be infection rate rising. I think the death rate's also in America not as great as in the first so-called wave. So he's trying to provide a bridge, but I think it's extremely difficult. And I don't want to be gloomy about it, but I see in the UK through autumn and winter, it's going to be extremely grim until we get probably to Q2, quarter 2 or quarter 3 of next year, when I think a vaccine will have kicked in by then. It'll be hopefully have been approved, produced, distributed, and people vaccinated. There will be some people who probably won't want to be vaccinated, but on the assumption that the bulk will be vaccinated, I think then we'll be out of this. I mean, from our own business point of view at S4, being a purely digital company, and it's also a sort of grim thing to say, but we've benefited really quite strongly from what's happened with COVID-19 and the impact.
What you think is going to be, if it is indeed that we're building a bridge to a vaccine or something that comes along in the future, what is going to be left of the economy by the time we reach that as yet unspecified, non-defined point? Because we can't keep borrowing £1 billion a day.
No, I agree. And COVID-19 has just accelerated the trends that we saw before. So if we, in our own narrow view, digital transformation or digital disruption has been heightened by COVID-19, what's happening in terms of working from home, people being more flexible in their work habits, assuming that digital transformation is going to happen even faster. What we saw happening before to the economy has been accelerated by what we've seen in the last 6 months, and all the things that have to be done in terms, and this actually, Tom, means more investment, not less investment. Public-private partnerships, reskilling the workforce, 5G hardware and software investment, all the things, re-education as the economy shifts in different ways, fundamentally from manufacturing to services and beyond. All this means that what we had to do before COVID-19 has become more and more important. And you're right. I mean, there is a big worry. Somebody has to pay for this at some point in time. I think inevitably it means that well, it's going to be the richer in the community. So people who are wealthier are going to have to stump up for it. There will be increases in capital gains tax. We see it in America. We see it in the American election between Biden and Trump. I mean, Biden will be more stimulus. There'll be more spending. Probably inflation will happen in the US economy faster than if there was a maintenance of the Trump regime. But somebody at some point is going to have to pay for it. We may have more inflation in America earlier than people thought. So the economy has to come into balance at some point in time. But at the moment, government's borrowing money, whether it's $1 billion or $1 trillion a day, they're borrowing money, and it's not costing them much to borrow.
So keep going. It would be your message in order to meet some of the challenges ahead. Keep going.
There has to be a broader partnership between the private sector and the public sector to retrain, reskill, adapt the economy. If you look at what's happening to the high street, for example, it means that we have to change the way that consumers, their needs are addressed in terms of retail stores and online shopping.
Well, just on that, I wonder if you've seen, Sir Martin, of what's happened in Wales, where non-essential items have been sort of polythened up. People can't go into a Tesco's to buy children's clothes, or they can't go and buy books from wherever. Obviously, that is going to force people online if they want them. I wonder what you make of it. Do you think, I wonder to what extent you think we've sort of slightly lost our minds here?
Well, I think it is a bit nanny state. So I tend to agree with you. I mean, who determines what is essential or not? You may remember in the early days of the pandemic in the US, Amazon was faced with exactly the same predicament. And they had to determine what was essential and it had to be the goods that had to be distributed and what was non-essential. And I think it has been taken too far. And obviously, I think at the end of the day, you have to let the consumer decide. So I think it has gone too far. Having said that, going back to your original question, if you or I were in Rishi Sunak's position, it'd be a dreadful predicament. You know, this balance between taking care of people's health and knocking out the economy, that balance is a very difficult one to get right.
Heck of a balance. Sir Martin, thank you very much indeed. Sir Martin Sorrell, founder and executive chairman of S4 Capital, founder of WPP, the world's largest advertising and PR group. Listening to that at 10:13 is Ian McCafferty, an economist who served on the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee between 2012 and 2018, a senior advisor at Oxford Economics. Thank you for joining the programme this morning, Mr. McCafferty. Just very quickly, we talk about all these figures, £1 billion a day, 200 billion being spent. Where is this money actually coming from?
Well, the government is essentially borrowing it in the financial markets. They are issuing gilts, and those are being bought partly by British investors, mostly pension funds, insurance companies, and the like, and some by foreigners.
So, to what extent then is the Bank of England printing this money?
Well, the Bank of England is not printing money per se. The Bank of England is indulging in monetary stimulus because it has increased the amount of quantitative easing that it has carried out. And what that means is that it is also one of the purchasers of the government bonds. Now, technically speaking, it does not buy new issue government bonds straight from the government. It buys them from within the market. But certainly the Bank of England is proving to be one of the purchasers of government debt at this stage.
How long can we carry on borrowing like this?
Well, I think the answer is not forever, but at this stage, I think it's very necessary to continue to spend and to continue to support the economy. Martin Sorrell talked about a bridge through the worst part of the virus until we can come up with a more permanent solution. And I think that's right, because if we don't provide that bridge, then I think the long-term damage to the economy from very high rates of unemployment, very high levels of bankruptcy, is going to leave the economy unable to stage a recovery once a vaccine comes through. So I think it's right for the time being to continue to borrow. And the debt figure that you quoted earlier, 100% of GDP, is by no means a magic number or a ceiling. There are plenty of G7 economies, the major advanced economies, with debt levels higher than that in the UK.
Japan's at 200%, I think, last time I looked.
Exactly, and some of the European economies, Belgium and others, have significantly higher. So
you seem, Mr. McCafferty, you seem very, sorry for interrupting, but you seem quite calm about the amount of money that is being borrowed and spent here, not least because, one, you say it is necessary, but also, presumably at some stage, we'll just find ways of paying it back?
Well, I think, at some stage we will have to pay it back. And I think at that stage, we will probably have to see quite significant tax rises. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has calculated that at the stage that it becomes appropriate to start paying it back, and I don't think that's yet, then we may need tax rises of up to £40 billion a year, which would be significant figures in terms of income tax, VAT, and other taxes. So it's not a negligible sum. But I think we need to spend at this stage in the same way that this is not a war, but we are in one sense in a wartime economy, although the enemy is a virus rather than another country, and you need to borrow to spend in order to sustain the economy in the country through the crisis period.
Good to talk to you. Ian McCafferty, economist who served on the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee between 2012 and 2018, Senior Advisor, Oxford Economics. 0345 6060 973. If you are one of the businesses that has received some of this support over the course of the last week, how necessary is it? And I wonder about any concerns regarding the cost of all of this. Is it, as Ian suggests, we are just in such a state here that you've got to keep throwing money at it in order to stave off a jobs crisis or an unemployment crisis that would happen if that money wasn't being spent? There are reports this morning that the Chancellor has been telling Cabinet colleagues that he will just not pay for another national lockdown. I wonder if you think that is right. 0345 6060 973 is the number. We'll speak to Theo Paphitis, chairman of the stationery chain Ryman's, homeowners specialist Robert Dias, of course, best known for being a dragon on Dragon's Den. Theo Paphitis will join us live in the next few moments. Swarbrick on Sunday here on LBC, 10:17.
This is LBC. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster on LBC.
Morning to you. 20 past 10 is the time. We'll speak to Theo Paphitis in just a moment. I'll run you through the front pages of the Sunday morning papers too. Just interested to pick up on what Sir Martin Sorrell and Ian McCafferty were telling us about the future of the economy during all of this, or after all of this. Mitch is in Ruislip. Tom, interesting to hear Sir Martin Sorrell, founder of WPP, saying all of us will have to pay for the COVID pandemic. Mitch says, why not make the Chinese government pay for it? Which feels like, Mitch, a line straight out of Donald Trump's playbook, to be honest. Mitch says they caused it, lied it, suppressed about it. Those who tried to flag it up, they threatened anyone who talks about an inquiry into its origins. They've single-handedly ruined the world's economy. Why shouldn't they cough up for it? Asks Mitch. Well, good luck trying to make him, Mitch, is all I say. 0345 6060 973. You see some of the reaction to the spread of the virus and the way in which different parts of the United Kingdom are reacting and the role that the economy plays in the spread of it, actually. I mean, what is the scientific evidence that says that polythene, whatever it is, covering up the books in plastic in Tesco's or the kitchenware or the kids' clothes in Asda, has an impact on the spread of the virus? Why is it that those people are being driven not to the shops to buy things, but presumably to go online? Who does that help ultimately? If you're struggling to keep going as a high street retailer selling apparently non-essential goods in Wales, how on earth are you going to recover after all of this? 0345 6060 973. Come to more of your calls in just a moment. Let's take a look at the front pages of those Sunday morning papers then. Let's start with the Mail on Sunday this morning. Some possible good news. They say in dramatic evidence of a major COVID breakthrough. Official memo seen by the Mail on Sunday reveals that NHS staff set to get vaccine in weeks. This is an email sent by NHS Trust Chief to his staff, seen by the Mail on Sunday. They are preparing for a national vaccination programme before Christmas. We might try and speak to the Secretary of State about that a bit later on this hour. Front page of The Observer, top children's doctors attack Tories over free school meals. 2,000 paediatricians back Marcus Rashford's drive. His picture is on the front page of the paper as well. That campaign showing no sign of abating, Tory anger growing at that as well. Over on at lbc.co.uk, lbc.co.uk. Open up the aisles, backlash over bonkers ban on Welsh supermarket essentials. I mean, I do think that this is a sign that we are slightly losing our minds here. By the way, and I'm never seeking to downplay this thing, because of course it's killed 50,000 people. It is responsible for all kinds of horror that has befallen people. It was barely in the top 20 of most deadly lethal illnesses in this country in the last month. Sunday Times revealed how elderly paid price of protecting NHS from coronavirus. Over 80s were denied intensive care. This is an investigation done by the paper. It's all the way through the paper. Big story that they're looking into. Sunday Mirror, scandal of neglected staff. Stop failing our NHS heroes. 2 million days off for mental illness, they say. On the Sunday Express front page, ministers fear Christmas virus rebels. Tory MPs demand clear roadmap out of local lockdowns. I think everyone's demanding a clear roadmap. If you've been in one of those local lockdowns for a long time, you're definitely asking for one. And the Sunday Telegraph, isolation for test and trace could be halved. Fears of non-compliance mean mandatory confinement may be cut to 7 days. That might be helpful in getting people back at work, getting people back into the economy to try and keep the spending up and try and keep some of this spending that's going on in check. On that note, let us turn to Theo Paphitis, chairman of stationery chain Ryman, the homewear specialist Robert Dias, and lingerie retailer Boo Avenue, and of course best known for his appearances as a dragon on Dragon's Den. Many thanks indeed for joining the programme this morning, Mr. Paphitis. Let's start with Wales. As a retailer yourself, I wonder what you make of what has been going on in supermarkets and retailers in Wales as a result of the lockdown.
Total nuts. Total and utter nuts. It's straight out of the Yes Minister sitcom sketch. I mean, who would have thought it? So you can, you have to isolate, you've got to stay at home, and you've got to wear a hair shirt as well. I mean, that's basically what they're saying to the people.
It's the Welsh government are saying that this is necessary in order to stop people going in and crowding and being too near each other when they're buying things that they don't necessarily need.
Well, what makes them say they don't necessarily need? If you need a frying pan, you need a frying pan.
So leave it up to the consumer.
I mean, so we can't go and get a frying pan. I mean, it's just nanny state gone bonkers. And obviously, this can't last. And if I was a betting man, which I'm not, I'd say this will be dead and gone by tomorrow.
How are you looking for some of your businesses, for Ryman's, for Robert Dias? How are things for you?
Well, listen, it's exactly as we said there would be. Central metropolitan areas have been hit really hard. Suburban areas, market towns where people have gone back shopping into their high street, because we're predominantly high street stores, and central London. So central London's been hit, central Manchester's been hit, but where you've got outside metropolitan areas, actually trading has not been too bad at all. So, we are actually pleased. And a total lockdown across the country, it would be a very detrimental thing for our business and most businesses, actually.
I see that in some of the more positive outlooks, consumer spending has actually bounced back up to pre-pandemic levels, which is presumably good for businesses like yours and others on high streets in and around market towns or smaller areas.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You can't say that if you include the central metropolitan areas. But if you take those out of the equation, you're not a million miles away from that. And, the biggest thing that really would have helped us all if the track and trace had been better focused during the summer months where we had a respite, so we could come back into the winter being able to cope with this, and the country could have, I mean, we're not going to be in no sense of normality for not until there's either a vaccine or a very credible treatment, quick treatment. Until we get those two things, we'll never get back to normality.
Do you think then, again, it's only a report in the paper, it's not confirmed, but the suggestion that Rishi Sunak is going around telling his cabinet colleagues that he's just not going to pay for another national lockdown, do you think he's right to suggest that actually the economic argument, the balancing of the books, as it used to be called, that does now need to take central stage here?
But it's not just the balancing of the books, is it? It's about killing whole rafts of industries and businesses that will not allow us to recover when we actually get those two things I talked about earlier, which is a vaccine or a treatment. So they will come. There's no doubt they will come. But we have to have something at the other side. When we've got a scorched earth policy at the other side, then we will be in trouble.
Can I just ask you about another story? It's on the front page of the Sunday Times. You're a big figure in the world of business, very well known. You may well therefore qualify for this exemption from a 14-day quarantine period if you're flying around the place to what the government or sources are suggesting to promote global Britain. Do you think it's right that city deal makers and hedge fund managers and company bosses are going to be able potentially to be exempted from this quarantine period, even if they're going to countries that are not on travel corridors?
Oh, come on. I mean, we've got to say common sense. It's not just about hedge fund managers or big city figures. Listen, at some stage, we have to get back
big dragons.
And I've lost a lot of weight recently, actually. I'm not that big anymore.
Slimmer dragons, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. Yeah. No, but seriously, we have to start having some form of travelling back again. And that has to be linked with testing at airports. That has to be linked with testing before leaving, testing before coming back. There is ways of doing this. And my biggest frustration is this blunderbuss approach that I understand why we did it at the beginning, right? Loads of blunderbuss approach. We didn't know what we were getting into. There was this pandemic coming and people were dying, hospitals were filling up. And, the government pulled the trigger on so many things, big things that caught loads of other things in the crossfire. But now we've been in it for quite a while. We need to do the work. We need to have the focus. We've got to show the moral compass. We've got to do the detail that allows us to bring that in. And no longer are we just spreading and shooting everything, but we deal with things individually.
Well, let's see if it happens. Theo Paphitis, grateful for your time this morning. You're chairman of stationery chain Ryman, homewares specialist Robert Dias, lingerie retailer Boo Avenue, and of course, a much slimmed down version of the dragon that you were on Dragon's Den. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Let's get Paul in Bromley on just before the news at past. Hiya, Paul.
Hello, yeah. I'm concerned that all the money that's being spent is going to be used as an excuse or a reason for a new round of austerity. Your second expert that was on was saying he seemed to be playing down the amount of quantitative easing that is being done. I mean, this means, the government is printing money, which, I mean, I can understand borrowing being a problem, but as a sovereign currency, we can print money, and I don't think there's any downsides to it.
Well, so depends on if inflation goes up and runs out of... You want a steward's inquiry into how much we're printing?
Compared to how much we're borrowing, yes.
Yeah. Well, this is partly, Paul, thank you, by the way. It's a good question. It's partly, I think, when the papers report this morning that the Chancellor is trying to get the Treasury to publish some of the economic forecasts to answer precisely those questions so we can all see the kind of decisions that are, or what are feeding into the decisions that are being made, because obviously, clearly, rightly, decisions about the economy are having a huge impact on what health measures are put into place. Paul, thank you. 0345 6060 973 is the number. We'll speak to Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Brandon Lewis. After the news headlines, we'll be joined by Labour's Rosena Allin-Khan as well. Tom Swarbrick here, Swarbrick on Sunday. 10:31 is the time. Your news headlines. Thomas Watts.
Close contacts of people in England infected with the coronavirus may have to self-isolate for as little as 7 days. There are concerns in Whitehall about levels of public compliance with the NHS test and trace system. In Wales, the First Minister has agreed to review a ban on supermarkets selling non-essential products. Retailers have been told to cover up items, including books and clothing, to level the playing field for shops forced to close. Senior Conservative MPs have joined calls for the government to rethink its position on free school meals over the holidays in England. Labour is threatening to push another Commons vote on the issue. And the weather, a mix of sunny spells and rain, the heaviest showers with hail and thunder in the west and south, a high of 13 Celsius.
This is LBC. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Text 84850.
Here's Mark on 84850 this morning. Morning to you, Mark. Tom, there's been a load of references to the war in relation to this COVID situation. Did we ask if we could afford it back then? And what's the comparisons between the UK and others, such as France and Spain, etc., says Mark. Mark, it's a good point. I guess there was a lot of work that had to go into building the economy back up after the Second World War, and maybe we might see something on a similar scale this time around. Let's turn to Brandon Lewis, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Conservative MP for Great Yarmouth. Thank you for joining the programme again on Sunday morning, Swarbrick on Sunday this morning, Mr. Lewis. Let me pick up on something that I just touched on with Theo Paphitis there about this 7-day quarantine rule. Are we going to see the time that people have to stay in now halved?
Well, I didn't hear that interview, I'm afraid, Tom. But look, the teams are working.
Well, it's front page of the Sunday Times, Mr. Lewis. I know, it's front page of the Sunday Times.
Yeah, no, I know the story. Yeah, the teams are looking at this at the moment. The Department of Health, working with the health experts, the medical experts, are looking at this at the moment. I'm not in a position, I'm afraid, to make an announcement this morning. We've not made any decisions on this yet, but they're just looking at what is feasible in terms of, as we're learning more and more about the virus and how it works and how it incubates with people, what we can do. But it will be a science-based decision, but it's not one we're ready to make just yet.
No decision yet, but you're clearly having a think about how it could be done, presumably as well to try and get compliance made better, given that it seems nobody is complying with the 14-day period if you've travelled to a country that's not on one of the travel corridors.
Well, yeah, the teams are looking at this, as I say, at the moment. They're absolutely looking at this. But to be fair, the team are looking at a whole range of things all the time, because obviously the knowledge, the experience, the understanding of how we treat, how we deal with, how we live with COVID is changing as we learn more about it, as we see how it's developing. So they're always looking at these things. I think that's the right thing to do, because obviously we want to facilitate people getting back as quickly as they can if they've had to isolate, to whatever form of normality we can live within the restrictions we're living in. So it's right that the team keep these things under review.
Well, let's look at one of those areas of review too, and something that a lot of your Conservative colleagues have been asking about is at what stage do people come out of the various tiers that they're placed in? Matt Hancock, in placing Stoke and Coventry and Slough into Tier 2 this week, said in all those areas there are more than 100 positive cases per 100,000 people. Cases are doubling approximately every fortnight, and we are seeing a concerning increase in cases among the over 60s. Is that now the criteria for being placed into Tier 2?
Well, I think it gives a good example of what the teams will look at. I mean, I've been through this experience as a constituency MP not that long ago, just in the last few weeks, where my own constituency had a spike, although they've got another spike now. And what happens is the local area will be working with the local health service, with the county and district councils, depending on the structure of local authority in that area, with Public Health England, the Department of Health, to assess a whole range of things about whether they understand where the outbreak has come from, how it's moving, what effect it's having, as you just outlined.
But are those the three sort of critical things that if you can do the checklist of, well, the cases are doubling, there are more than 100 and we're worried about over 60s, bang, 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 right, you go into Tier 2.
I would actually, Tom, I would say they're a very good example of the things they will look at, and in those areas they have been key things. In other areas they'll look at different things. So in Great Yarmouth they looked at those issues where it was rising, but also what the local authority and the local teams are able to do to try and get on top of the virus, and understanding that it was coming primarily from two key company
so it's a very
sources.
local decision, right? It's a very local approach.
Yeah, and it's done in partnership with local authorities wherever we can. Obviously, Greater Manchester being a good example where we weren't able to secure an agreement with Andy Burnham, and we've had to make some decisions, but we're still working with the local authorities in that area.
How do you come out of Tier 2 or Tier 3?
Well, again, it's an assessment working with the local area. When we get to that point, and obviously we've seen over the summer where we had the earlier restrictions before we had the tier system, where a couple of areas went up in terms of increasing their restrictions, and then as the numbers fell, they were able to come back out of those restrictions. Similarly with the new tier system.
And who gets the final say on that? If it is a local-led approach, and you've had these rows with local mayors this week, if it is a local-led approach and you've got mayors and public health locally on the ground saying, right, we're done here with Tier 3, we can come out now, would it be the government that has the final say centrally, or would local authorities get to decide?
Well, the key is to try and do it in partnership. It is so in those conversations, my experience has been that you've got the local authority, the county council, Public Health England, the local NHS, Department of Health, all coming together to have these conversations to understand what is the right decision. Ultimately, in many areas, this ultimately, technically, legally is a government sign-off decision, but you're doing this in partnership as much as you can.
Let me ask about the money then that the Chancellor talked about and that we've been talking about this morning. How long is the support that the Chancellor announced this week in place for?
Well, the support that we've outlined, I mean, it ranges, but what goes through till spring next year, depending obviously on what the requirements are, what the restrictions are. When people go into Tier 3, there are specific bits of support we'll put in there. And as the Chancellor's shown, to be fair, from the beginning of this crisis of the virus, he will assess and amend things as we need to, depending on what is required to keep the economy moving, to keep people being able to live through this virus.
So by the end, by spring, if it's not, if the rates aren't down, and if there's still a problem, and God willing there won't be, he will turn the taps. He will keep the taps turned on. He will keep that funding there.
Well, both the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have been clear. We don't want to leave anybody behind. We want to make sure we've got the support in there for people and for businesses to have to get through this virus as best we can. Sadly, you can't save every single job, but we are doing our best to support the economy. He's made changes as he's needed to throughout the virus, as we've learnt more about it, as restrictions have changed, and he'll continue to keep this under review.
And are you comfortable with the amounts that are being borrowed here? Again, the figures suggest around £1 billion a day. Is there a point at which the government, the Chancellor, the Treasury, yourself, I don't know, arguing in Cabinet, says this is getting a bit too much now, we're paying too much, it's too steep?
Well, I understand. I know some people, I've seen this in the press today, are concerned about what happens in the future. But the reality is, there is also a point at which if you don't put that support in place so that the economy has its core skeleton able to re-function after COVID, then things can be even worse if we're not careful. So we've got to make sure that the support we're putting in place means that people can continue to live, businesses as far as possible can continue to survive, to look at the ability to have that growth again after COVID. Because in the long run, that's the best thing for our economy. The ability to pay this back is to see our economy grow, the productivity increase, and our country to become continue to be one of the most competitive, fast-growing economies in the world.
We're talking about £1 billion a day. That's about £750,000. I'm sure you know this already, Brandon. You've done the sums, but that's about £750,000 a minute. 20 minutes worth of borrowing at that level would feed the poorest children and extend the free school meal vouchers. Can you categorically rule out a U-turn on that?
Well, I think, first of all, let's get the facts, because there's a lot of misinformation about this out there. We absolutely support free school meals. They've been in place since 1906. There's a difference between now and where we were in the summer. And I hugely congratulate Marcus Rashford on. He's raised the profile on this in a phenomenal way. And that's a brilliant thing to do, that more and more people are now more aware.
It's caused you a headache, though, hasn't it?
Poverty. Pardon?
It's caused number 10 a headache. It's caused the government a massive problem, hasn't it?
Actually, no, I don't think it's... I think what Marcus Rashford is doing and organisations that are supporting that works brilliantly to make sure that anybody in their community who can help others in their community are doing their bit for their community. That's absolutely the heart of being British. It's one of the things we should all be proud of in our country. As a government, obviously schools, 99% of schools are now reopened. It's not like it was in the summer. In school term time, free school meals are there. The issue is around what you do in the holiday period, like the half term we're now in. And what we've done is taken the view that as schools are now open and are functioning properly again, we should revert to the system that's always been in place, and actually particularly putting in extra support because of COVID. So in the school holidays, we are putting that support in for families who need that help.
So
we're doing
people,
that both
so families who need that help.
Credit.
Yeah, so the increases in universal credit and the funding that has gone to local authorities.
Absolutely,
you say that the government is saying, the government is saying that is enough. That children should not be going hungry in holiday periods, because those who are entitled to that support should be able to pay for food for their kids. Is that what the government's saying?
And the £63 million we're putting into local authority. First, the universal credit uplift of around £1,000 a year goes to the families who are on universal credit. But on top of that, and actually this is on top of the extra money we've put in to help those families most in need around their housing support allowances, nearly 200 million,
and that's enough
as well. But the 63, well, very specifically, Tom, the 63 million, which goes to, obviously, furlough continues to the end of October and covers the half-term period as well. So there's a whole package of things there. But the 63 million extra on top of the hundreds of millions that local authorities have had for support for their communities through COVID, this 63 million is very specifically for them to use for families and the local communities in hardship. And we're seeing many local authorities very specifically using it for some form of food voucher in the half-term break.
But if it is,
and that's because they know their local area best.
Just finally, Mr. Lewis, if it is the case that this money is there, ready to go for councils to help spend on helping those who are in need of this, why is there still a problem with children going hungry during the school holiday period? Why, if the money is in place, why is there still a problem?
Well, as I say, with that money in place, both through universal credit and through the local authorities, there is the ability for those areas to target those most in need to ensure that nobody goes without in the half-term breaks. So that support is there.
So councils not getting it to people?
Well, as I say, local councils will take an assessment of what they feel is appropriate. Don't forget, we're not in the half-term period yet, but technically that starts tomorrow for the schools. And I would hope we will find, because that money is in place, that local authorities are making sure those families who need that support have got it. They've also directly got the extra money that is there through universal credit.
Some of your Conservative colleagues are suggesting that they might see grants withheld from businesses who have offered to provide free school meals.
Well, I think businesses who are offering extra and doing that bit extra from their company, and these are businesses that work in their communities, deliver in their communities, playing their part in their community, is a good thing to do in various formats. Commercial, private companies have done that for many, many years. If in this half term some are doing it because they want to help in their community with extra meals for families, I think we should be saying well done to them and congratulations to that.
But they're not going to get any government.
Part of what we do from the no, they do get government support. The government.
No, they do, but they're not going to get any more government support. That's it now. Despite the borrowing that's happening at the moment to pay for all of this. £1 billion a day. You are saying now, and you're categorically ruling out a U-turn on this particular policy. Labour are thinking about forcing another vote.
I think the principle of that point is wrong, Tom. It's not about a U-turn. We've put this support in. Some of the papers you would have seen outline that they believe free school meals is about £20 million a week. We've got a 1 week half term. Local authorities have got £63 million to make sure that those in most need, those in hardship, can have the support that they need.
All right. Brandon Lewis, good to talk to you as always. Thank you for coming on the programme. Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Conservative MP for Great Yarmouth. Continue to take your calls in a few moments as well. And we'll speak to Labour. Labour's Rosena Allin-Khan is going to join us to talk not least about mental health and the challenges that people are having with dealing with their mental health as a result of all of this, but also some of the issues that Labour have around that free school meals policy and, of course, with their plan for a circuit breaker. We'll speak to Rosena Allin-Khan in a few moments. Tom Swarbrick here, 10:47.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast, LBC.
Policing Minister Kit Malthouse, the Assistant Chief Constable of Hertfordshire, had to accept yesterday he doesn't know the rules. Minister, if he doesn't know the rules, why should my listeners?
Well, they should, because it's very important.
Chief Constable Andy Rhodes said the big one in moving from Tier 1 to Tier 3 is your household not mixing with others inside your house. Was he right with that?
No, you can't mix inside in private space in Tier 2 or Tier 3.
So that's two senior police officers, neither of whom got it right. And you're expecting all my listeners to get it right all the time, or in some instances, they'll be fined £1,000.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast, weekday mornings from 7, LBC. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Morning to you, Adrian in East Grinstead. Come to your call in a few moments' time. Plus a reminder, after the news at 11, the first live interview with Sir Mark Sedwill, former head of the Cabinet Office, former head of the Civil Service, former National Security Advisor, left government a month or so ago. His first live interview on this programme after the news at 11. Let's turn first, though, to Dr. Rosena Allin-Khan, Shadow Minister for Mental Health, Labour MP for Tooting, joining the programme this morning. Good to see you, Dr. Allin-Khan. Thank you for being there for us. Let's start off by talking about a real worry for lots and lots of people, which is their mental health at this time, and a warning from NHS bosses that accuse Boris Johnson of structural discrimination against mental health. Can you tell us what you think is meant by that?
Well, I think it's very clear that the government have turned a blind eye to the mental health crisis that has exploded following the government's response to COVID-19. And we are calling for a mental health and wellbeing guarantee from the government as we move into winter. And I work on the NHS frontline. I'm really proud to do so. And I wanted to work with the government to implement Labour's Care for Carers package. But they have just refused to meet with me on this. And it would have provided 24/7 structured, tailored mental health support for frontline NHS and care staff, with no one left behind, saying everyone's just as important, whether you are a porter, a cleaner, we value you all, but understanding that everyone is really suffering with their mental health, particularly frontline workers. They have post-traumatic stress disorder, they've got anxiety, depression. And so I think people have seen the government not being willing to meet and work cross-party to talk about this.
Is that because there aren't enough people trained to be able to provide the support, given how many people are clearly going to be affected by this, do you think?
I think there is definitely a workforce issue, because we know that even pre-COVID, our mental health services were under-resourced, if we're really honest. But I think it would have been really welcome for the government to sit down and discuss the Care for Carers package, which I believe we would have had the staff to deliver. But ultimately, it's just a false economy not to invest in our frontline health and care workers' mental health, because they've been going to work every day throughout the pandemic to keep us safe. And we know that in June, 32% of all NHS staff sickness was due to mental health, which is even more than being off due to having the virus and COVID-19 related issues.
Let's see if the government meet with you on that. Coming to other issues, if I may, the government in Wales, the Labour-run government in Wales, is banning the sale of books in supermarkets. Do you agree with that? Are you comfortable with that?
Well, I know people have found that hard, and I think people have, rightly challenged the Welsh government over it, and the Welsh government have said that they are listening and they'll take that into account.
They found it bizarre.
I think people have found it unusual, I'll be honest, but the Welsh government are listening, which is more than what our government have been doing. And the Welsh government, they have provided a really good financial package of support. They have a contact tracing rate of 90%, where we can't even make it to 68%.
Oh, I'm sure they're doing well on that, and they're doing better than that on the English government's test and trace and mental health, I'm sure too. But on how this appears to people, the banning of the sale of non-essential items, kitchenware, children's clothes, socks, books from these shops, I haven't quite heard whether the Labour Party in London, in Westminster, agrees with them in doing that.
Well, what we are saying is that we think it's a really good thing that they are listening to their communities who have said that they're struggling with that and that they're going to review it.
Does that mean you want them to U-turn? Does that mean you think that a U-turn's coming? You think that they're going to say, OK, maybe we got this a bit wrong, we're trying to protect people, but perhaps on this we went too far?
Well, they definitely said that they are listening to people and they're going to review it. And so that's what I believe that they'll do.
OK. Keir Starmer has talked about the circuit breaker that he wants to see happen in this country for a couple of weeks. And he asked the Prime Minister at PMQs about how areas come out of Tier 3. The PM suggested it was about getting the R below 1. How would Labour get England out of the circuit breaker that it proposes?
I think we have to be very clear that we are calling for a 2 to 3 week circuit breaker to be just that, 2 to 3 weeks, as an opportunity to get on top of the virus and give the government the opportunity to fix the broken test, trace and isolate system. That is why we're calling for it. And that will
let me separate that out. So we don't
be better for our economy.
The last lockdown, how long did it take to get R below 1 from where it was before, 3 or 2.5? How long did it take to get that down to an acceptable level that we could come out from?
I mean, that was a considerable number of months, but we're not asking for a return to that protracted period of lockdown. What we are calling for is a circuit breaker to give us a chance to get on top of the virus, drive down transmission. And we know that ultimately it will be better for our economy and it will save lives. And I think
But if after 2 or 3 weeks, R is still above 1, presumably that means that it has to continue.
We're very, very clear that we want it just to be a 2 to 3 week circuit breaker, which Sage said that they believed would be successful. We are taking the advice of Sage. And we are saying that it will just be for 2 to 3 weeks to give the government a chance to get on top of the test, trace and isolate system, which is so greatly needed. Like, we have been calling for the test, trace and isolate system to be in the hands of our communities, for our public health teams who know the communities to roll out. And we know that they have a 97.1% contact tracing
and that
rate.
test and trace system needs work. But it might be a lot. And Serco have got huge questions to answer about their role in all of this. But it's a lot to ask people to go into a 2 or 3 week circuit breaker with shops closed, with schools affected, with people's work affected, in order to help build up the test and trace system. Because you can't guarantee that the R will come below 1 in 2 or 3 weeks.
I understand. But Tom, what we're looking at is some parts of the country who for the best part of 7 months have been in some form of local lockdown, local restrictions, unable to see their loved ones. We're calling for a 2 to 3 week circuit breaker and we wanted it now.
You're applying that to the whole country.
Period. Sorry?
You're applying that to the whole country.
Yes, we're applying it to the whole country because that is what Sage is saying will help drive down transmission of the virus. It will give us an opportunity to get on top of test, trace and isolate. And the IMF said that if we don't do that, it could cost our economy £110 billion. We are not calling for a protracted, lengthy lockdown. We're calling for a 2 to 3 week circuit breaker so people can have some hope of potentially being with their families at Christmas.
Dr. Rosena Allin-Khan, really grateful for your time this morning. Thank you for coming on the programme. You're Shadow Minister for Mental Health, Labour MP for Tooting. Very good to see you. Thank you very much indeed for your time. We move on. Coming up after the news at 11 o'clock, he was the man who ran the National Security Council for at least 2 years. Former National Security Advisor Sir Mark Sedwill, promoted after Brexit to running the Civil Service, no less, and was there in the thick of it during the early months of this pandemic. Sir Mark Sedwill is joining us live for his first live interview since leaving government after the news at 11 on how the government dealt with coronavirus, how the government dealt with Trump. He's been chairing the Atlantic Future Forum Council, an organisation that brings together US and UK leadership to talk about the future relationship between those two countries. How would a Trump second term affect that? How would President Biden affect that? Sir Mark Sedwill joining us live exclusively on Swarbrick on Sunday. After the news.
On your radio, on Global Player and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 11 o'clock. A cabinet minister has confirmed officials are considering a change to coronavirus self-isolation rules in England. Close contacts of people who test positive could be asked to quarantine for 7 days rather than the current 2-week period. It follows concerns about the level of public compliance with the measures. Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis has been speaking to Swarbrick on Sunday on LBC.
We've not made any decisions on this yet, but they're just looking at what is feasible in terms of, as we're learning more and more about the virus and how it works and how it incubates with people, what we can do. But it will be a science-based decision, but it's not one we're ready to make just yet.
The Welsh Government has agreed to review a ban on the sale of non-essential items in supermarkets. Retailers have been asked to stop selling items such as clothes and books to level the playing field for shops ordered to shut. Theo Paphitis is the owner of high street brands Ryman and Robert Dyers. He's told Swarbrick on Sunday on LBC that ministers in Wales need to rethink the rules.
Total nuts. If you need a frying pan, you need a frying pan.
So leave it up to the consumer.
I mean, so we can't go and get a frying pan. I mean, it's just nanny state gone bonkers. And obviously this can't last. And if I was a betting man, which I'm not, I'd say this will be dead and gone by tomorrow.
Senior Conservative MPs are among those urging Boris Johnson to reconsider government policy on free school meals. Earlier this week, the Commons defeated a motion calling for the extension of vouchers for vulnerable children over the school holidays in England. More than 2,000 paediatricians have now signed a letter in support of the policy. England's Children's Commissioner Anne Longfield says she's horrified by the decision.
It's 2020, and have a debate about whether we should make sure that hungry and vulnerable children should have enough to eat is something which is strikingly similar to chapters, I think, of what we'd expect to see in Oliver Twist, a novel published in the 19th century.
The government says low-income families can be helped more effectively through targeted measures. France is recalling its ambassador to Turkey after objecting to comments made by President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Mr. Erdogan said President Macron needed a mental health check for pledging to fight radical Islam. The French leader has spoken of the need to defend secular values following the murder of a teacher for showing his class cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. And a retired army major has reached the halfway mark in his charity challenge to row 100 miles in a homemade boat. 80-year-old Michael Stanley built the vessel, named the Titanic, out of 2 sheets of corrugated iron, curtain hooks and a hosepipe. He's raising money for a hospice in West Sussex. And the weather, he'll have to contend with sunny intervals and plenty of rain. The heaviest showers with hail and thunder in the west and the south, a high of 13 Celsius. From Global's newsroom, I'm Thomas Watts.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC.
Very good morning to you. Just gone 11 o'clock. You are listening to Swarbrick on Sunday here on LBC. I'm Tom Swarbrick. Hope we find you very well this Sunday morning. We want to talk in a few moments' time to Sir Mark Sedwill, former National Security Advisor, former head of the Civil Service. He left government a month or so ago. We'll be speaking to him about the government's response to coronavirus, about the US elections, about what the response says about the state, how we were able as a country to manage through this thing as we continue to battle against it. To that extent, I want to talk after the news at 12 in more detail about what on earth has been going on in Wales. You've heard some of our conversation about it already with people like Theo Paphitis and Sir Martin Sorrell. Indeed, Labour's Dr. Rosena Allin-Khan was sort of hoping that the Labour government in Wales might be listening a bit more carefully to what it is people are saying about the measures which have seen bookshelves had plastic put over them, or sort of almost like police tape put over kids' clothing in supermarkets, so they're deemed non-essential and therefore unable to be bought in those shops. I want to talk about it in more detail after 12. Let's get an update, though, from Mike Hughes, LBC's reporter in Wales, who joins me live on the programme. Mike, thank you for being there for us. Tell us a little bit more about the listening that the Welsh Government is doing this morning on this.
Well, Tom, there is definitely a sense this morning that the displeasure among the general public, which are seeing the shelves taped off or covered in plastic sheeting, indicating that the items behind them are not for sale, is starting to seep through to the Welsh Government. Last night, the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, put out a tweet saying that he understood people were frustrated by the rules and that there would be what he called a review of the situation. Now, ministers have been doing the rounds this morning on all of the political programmes, and of course there's been ministers tweeting away this morning as well. And the Welsh Government were hoping that this review would offer some sort of clarity, but appears to be more clarifications on top of clarifications. So what I understand this morning is that this review will essentially be how things are playing out on the ground as opposed to the actual restrictions themselves. So basically, where the Welsh Government think it's going wrong is that there has been a lack of information getting through to retailers about the kind of items that can go on sale. For instance, there was a clarification bizarrely put out through the Welsh Government's official Twitter channel last night that stationery is allowed to be sold. And this is after images appeared on social media of the stationery shelves in supermarkets all taped up and covered up, and people were going, well, hold on a second, I thought this was allowed. So clearly there is confusion among retailers about what items can be sold, and I understand this review of the situation, which is due to take place tomorrow, is going to be around how this is practicably playing out on the ground as opposed to the limitations themselves. The Health Minister, Vaughan Gething, clear this morning, the Counsel General Jeremy Miles as well clear this morning that the essential items rule will remain in place. It's more the kind of items that will be allowed to be sold. What I would say, Tom, is that the First Minister and the way this has been put into practice, the Welsh Government has done itself no favours at all, really.
No,
we first learned about this restriction on items on Thursday afternoon when the First Minister was appearing before a scrutiny committee in the Senedd. He was questioned by a Conservative politician about fair play among retailers and why supermarkets, for instance, would be allowed to sell clothes traditionally during this time of lockdown, where a boutique on a high street, a small retailer, for instance, would have to close. And the First
Minister... One of the suggestions, Mike, is that actually this is going to do incredible harm to some of the high street retailers around Wales as everybody just goes online to buy the items that they could otherwise get. Listen, Mike, really grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed. You're Mike Hughes, LBC's reporter in Wales, in Pontypridd for us. We'll carry on that conversation after the news at 12 o'clock. We'll speak to a former Secretary of State about what it is that's going on in Wales and what the Welsh Government should do about it. Talking of how the state handles it, let's turn to Lord Mark Sedwill, who was, of course, a former National Security Advisor until a month or so ago, and the former head of the Civil Service, and had to deal with, was in government when dealing with the coronavirus challenge that we all know about and is affecting our daily lives today. Hey, Lord Sedwill, good to see you. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme this morning. I noticed from looking at you that you've got a bit of a tan. You look about 20 years younger. Clearly, coming out of government has suited you a bit, right?
Yeah, and that's after less than a month. So if you interview me in 6 months' time, I'll look about your age, Tom.
Thank you very much. Listen, we'll come on to coronavirus in a bit. I want to talk about the AFF, the Atlantic Future Forum, that you've been chairing this week. Tell us what this conference is designed to do and what you talked about.
Thanks, Tom. Well, it's a British and American security conference. Takes place on the aircraft carrier, the new aircraft carrier, HMS Queen Elizabeth. It's the third one, and we held it in Portsmouth this year. And essentially, it's similar to other kinds of events of this kind. What we try to do is bring together military and civilian experts, business and government, to look at the range of issues that face the Atlantic Alliance, obviously with the UK and US at the heart of it, but with other countries as well. And this week, we covered everything from climate change through to the threat from Russia and a whole range of other issues as well. It took place over a couple of days. And next year, we'll be taking the forum into the Pacific and back to the United States as well to mark the 80th anniversary of the Atlantic Charter.
You've talked before about how the US relationship with the UK is pretty stable. But perhaps beneath the political level, there are lots of cooperation going on, military, foreign policy, defence-related, that are stable and have been the bedrock of it. I wonder what you think Donald Trump, the current president, has got right on security and defence.
Well, he's actually, despite some of the rhetoric from him about sceptical about US membership of NATO, he's actually invested more US military capability in Western Europe, and partly through the pressure he's created, and partly because he is sharp on this issue, has managed to generate, with Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, more investment in defence among the nations of Western Europe. We committed several years ago at the Wales NATO summit, obviously presided over by the UK, I think in 2014 actually, a commitment by all NATO nations to invest 2% of national income in defence. We hit that target, most don't, and President Trump has been pressing others to do so. So just in our own hemisphere, he has some achievements to his name in partnership with Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General. Elsewhere, you've got the Abraham Accords and so on as well. Yeah. But just in our own hemisphere, I think that's an important step forward.
So it hasn't been some, as you say, the narrative around this is that it's a total disaster. Your view is that he's actually driven the argument to make Europe and possibly the US and Europe safer.
Well, I think we've had our ups and downs with him, obviously, and there are significant. As you'll recall from your own time in government, and there are significant trade issues between the US and the EU. So it hasn't all been smooth. I don't think anyone would claim that. But you asked me about the positive achievements, and I think investing more US capability in Western Europe as we deal with a broader and more sophisticated threat from Russia particularly, and encouraging European nations to invest more has been important. We need US leadership, but that leadership needs the rest of us to share the burden and share the burden fairly. And there's been some forward movement on that.
And some are arguing now that I see the former Chancellor, Sajid Javid, is saying that actually President Biden would benefit Britain more. I wonder what you think.
I imagine President Biden would pursue some of the same policies as President Trump. The tone and style will clearly be different. We've seen that from the debates.
And
but I think we just have to see what the
government.
Well, I think we just have to see what the substance is in the end. Different presidents have different styles. The special relationship, as you said at the beginning, Tom, has very deep roots. There's sometimes and often actually been a strong rapport between British prime ministers and US presidents, including when they come from different political traditions, as much as when they come from the same sort of side of the aisle, if you like. And that all helps. But in the end, it's the substance which really matters.
And we're a couple of days away, or not too far away, a week or so away from finding out the answer to that. Let me turn to coronavirus, because you've been asked about this recently, and you've talked about separating two things: whether the right decisions were made at the right time, which is obviously the preserve of any inquiry that's going to come, with what capabilities did the state have to deploy against the coronavirus. You've said, quotes, that we should have invested more in contingency capabilities. I wonder which.
Well, so, I mean, just to give you an example, we have a smaller proportion of intensive care beds per head than some of our European partners. Now, healthcare systems are different. They provide services in different ways. But you may recall earlier at the beginning of the crisis, when we were in the spring, we were very concerned about whether we would have enough ventilators, enough intensive care capacity, particularly when we saw that in other European nations, they were struggling to provide that kind of capability to their citizens, and we took measures to respond to that.
Yes, the investment in building up the Nightingale hospitals. Do you think that had to happen very quickly and was successful? These things now exist, but do you think that it shouldn't have been the case that we needed to invest in that way at that speed in order to build up that particular capacity, which is so critical?
No, in fact, I don't. I think it was right probably to do it in the way that we did. It's important to keep in mind that if the pandemic disease were a different disease, then the response would have to have been different as well, and we might have required different capacities. And you can't, with the inevitable resource constraints there are, invest in contingent capabilities against every different scenario. And of course, these are choices. Governments over many years have had to make choices between what to invest in contingent capability, if you like, what insurance policies to buy, versus investing those same resources in current capacity within the health system,
but not enough was invested in those contingency
to deal with the pressures. Well, I mean, I think that's genuinely a question for the inquiry. I haven't actually. I'm not enough of an expert on the exact detail of that to make a judgment. What I said was I thought the inquiry would have to tackle that question, essentially the baseline from which we started, as well as the decisions that were taken amidst the crisis.
Let me come on to your role specifically as National Security Advisor. The National Risk Register has a pandemic in the top tier of risks to the UK. That's been there for some time. Did the National Security Council under you ever discuss policy responses to a pandemic?
We did deal with it. It was actually normally dealt with outside the main council itself, but the main council itself looked at the whole register and is, if you like, at the peak of the assurance process to ensure that the right mechanisms are in place below that level. But individual risks are the responsibility. This is long before coronavirus hit us. Individual risks each have a lead department or more than one responsible for them and responsible for the plans. And the job of the NSC is essentially assure that entire system.
Yes, and what did the NSC, having seen the preparations, make of those preparations?
Well, the NSC had looked at the pandemic exercises that we had carried out, Exercise Cygnus, some years ago, and we then started to apply some of the lessons of those. So, for example, the legislation, the emergency public health legislation that was passed in the spring to enable various powers to be taken by government arose from those earlier exercises. So it's a constant process of review.
Do you think you responded quickly enough? Because the conclusions of Exercise Cygnus, this is the exercise done to undertake a pandemic response, was, quote, the UK's preparedness and response in terms of its plans, policies and capability is currently not sufficient to cope with the extreme demands of a severe pandemic that will have nationwide impact across all sectors. That exercise was done in 2016. Was the only thing that the NSC pushed out of that legislation then?
No, I mean, I just gave that as an example, but this then comes back, Tom, to the essentially the resource investments that had to be made as a result of that, but as a result of other inputs and judgments as well, in the subsequent spending reviews, because obviously increasing preparedness, increasing contingency capability requires investment and resources, and those are judgments that are made at each spending review.
And this is a top tier threat. I mean, this is the single biggest risk that the country was facing according to the National Risk Register. You must have been tearing your hair out, were you, at the idea that this wasn't being invested in, or you were seeing things falling away despite the exercises that were undertaken?
Well, Tom, I'm not. I mean, it wouldn't be right for me to comment on the internal discussions of government beyond the things I've already said. I mean, no, and I've always been very clear that as National Security Advisor and as Cabinet Secretary, it's important, even though I no longer fulfil those roles, I maintain the confidence of those internal discussions. It's not. But I think what I should emphasise is governments have to make resource choices. They have to prioritise, and you can't simply say, well, something sits at the top of a list, and therefore it must have every single last penny it needs compared to other things. You're always balancing a range of different risks off against each other, and particularly in national security, where the range of, sort of, if you like, core national security risks has diversified and become more sophisticated. This is not the national security risk register; it's the national risk register, and there's a whole range of other issues, floods, other extreme weather events in which we have to invest, and governments have to just make these judgments and balance these different risks against each other. It's a political
decision. Let me just
fundamentally, it has to be. Yeah. It has to be.
Let me just put this to you very finally. Rory Stewart, former Cabinet Minister, I think was on the National Security Council quite briefly, is quoted as saying, nobody on the National Security Council wants to tell you what a total joke the National Security Council is. I wonder what your response to that is.
I haven't heard Rory say that, and actually he only attended it as a member briefly when he was the Secretary of State for Development towards the end of the last administration. I simply don't, I mean, if whether or not Rory himself has said that, I simply don't agree with that view. The National Security Council brought together all of the national security community. Actually, there were some predecessors to it before it was launched under David Cameron. Gordon Brown had a similar kind of mechanism, and that's enabled us to bring together, particularly on core national security questions, all of the capabilities of government in a way that was harder to do beforehand. And that fusion or coordination or integration, choose your word, in my view, has improved our response to some of the national security challenges we face.
I know I have to let you go shortly, but just on a couple of more areas. You've described the time in March and April in government as being, quote, tense, which I think is showing that you've been a diplomat for a long time to describe it as tense. I wonder what the worst moment of it for you was when you were in there.
I think in that period, probably for many of us, and actually the Foreign Secretary has talked about this, was when the Prime Minister himself went into intensive care, because this was obviously a very high-pressure environment for everyone. He was providing the political leadership, and when he went into intensive care, and when the system worked very well to respond, with Dominic Raab as First Secretary stepping in. But I think all of us would agree that was a really challenging moment.
Did you think he was going to die?
No, but nor could we neglect the risk that he would be he would either be seriously ill for a long period, and of course, the statistics show that one couldn't rule out anything after he was taken into intensive care. And it's really continuity of government requires us to have in place contingency plans against a Prime Minister being indisposed.
But you nevertheless felt that the system underneath it worked quite well, that it wasn't as shaky as it may have appeared from the outside, the whole system of government, because it felt, once the Prime Minister was incapacitated like that it was really struggling.
Yeah, I actually don't think it did. In the national security side, we have very well-rehearsed plans for this, because it might simply be a crisis develops so swiftly that a Prime Minister is just out of contact. And that might be a terrorist incident or something relating to the defence of the realm and so on. And so we have people who can step in for him, even temporarily, if the Prime Minister is out of contact, indisposed, etc. Actually, so all of that clicked in very naturally. We'd agreed with the PM what we were going to do were he to have to go into intensive care, because it meant that he wasn't accessible to take decisions. Dominic Raab's first secretary stepped in, collective government worked. I actually think the decisions that we took during that period were well executed.
Tense is one way of describing it. It must have been, just horrendous to be in there and have to make decisions in that environment. Just very finally, on the integrated review that's taking place, this defence review, which there's been lots of discussions this week about whether it's going to be halted, whether it's going to be pushed back, or if enough money is going to be able there to make it a proper review into both foreign defence and aid spending too. If there's one change that you could make, what is it that you would be pushing for from the outside?
I think, actually, in a sense, Tom, the clue is in the title. The key thing is that this is integrated. We developed, and you'll recall from the National Security Capability Review, which didn't involve additional resources at that time in 2017, the fusion doctrine. That was a development of the process we discussed a minute ago to ensure that all of national security assets and capabilities are brought together in support of our objectives. That's the starting point for this review. Really important. It's the end point too.
Yeah. Can I ask you about space? Do you think that's one area of cooperation with the US, because they're launching the Trump Space Force plan? Do you think that's an area that the US and UK could combine on?
I think space is now an alliance domain, and it's clearly an area we should cooperate on with our allies. It's an important new domain, as is cyberspace, and that's another area for alliance cooperation too.
And just very finally, before I let you get on with your Sunday morning, Sir Mark, I spoke to one of your former colleagues, General H.R. McMaster, who I know that you worked with when he was in the Trump administration. And I interviewed him on the programme the other week, and he said, in his words, he thought it was plausible that the coronavirus was accidentally leaked from a lab. I wonder whether you agree.
I've seen no evidence to that effect at all, and obviously people have looked very carefully at that. So in the absence of that evidence, I think we have to treat it at face value. This was a natural phenomenon that arose and, of course, then became a global pandemic.
So, Mark, thank you so much for coming on the programme. It's good to see you again. I hope you're enjoying your time outside of government and being able to work on the tan. Thank you very much, as well as many other things, of course. I'm not saying that you're just sunning yourself the whole time, but you deserve a break. Hey, listen, thank you very much for joining the programme. Lord Mark Sedwill, former Cabinet Secretary, head of the Civil Service, former National Security Advisor, first live interview here on Swarbrick on Sunday. I wonder what you made of that. To me, the really key bit that we are all battling with right now is to what extent did the state have the capabilities to respond quickly and efficiently to a pandemic that was telegraphed as a massive threat to the country in the first place? Those levers that had to be pulled to get the intensive care beds, to get the PPE, of which there was a global shortage, as Sir Mark has talked about, to get the test and traced working and up to scratch. Did government know about some of the things that it could have done in advance? I think you heard Sir Mark there talk about the political decisions that were behind some of the reasons why perhaps the capabilities to respond were not there. Does that mean that ultimately it is the politicians, perhaps over many, many years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, however long we've been worried about this, who are ultimately responsible for what feels like a break glass and emergency response to this? Should it be the case that more should have been prepared for in advance? And if one of the lessons of this whole shooting match is one of the lessons of it going to be that we just have to spend much, much more money on making PPE closer to home, building in the supply chains here to allow for greater ability to get our hands on stuff rather than relying perhaps on a too globalised economy that means that if you can't get what you desperately need from China one month actually the next month that's going to become completely vital, and so you're better off building it here rather than outsourcing it to other places. 0345 6060 973 84850 to text. You can tweet at LBC as well. Very keen to hear your thoughts on what you made of Sir Mark's interview there, what you felt has gone well about the government's response or badly about the government's response, particularly not just in this country but also in the US as well. You heard him talk about President Trump there, who in his view has made some good calls, some right decisions about funding for NATO and other areas of defence. I wonder if you think that's a fair assessment of Donald Trump's first, possibly last, 4 years in office. 0345 6060 973. Let's come to some of your calls. Here's Adrian in East Grinstead this morning. Hi, Adrian.
Hi there.
Hi.
Mark Sedwill, yeah, I know, he's a very professional guy, obviously. And I think it ought to remind us once in a while that while we're always very good at caning civil servants, there's a deep professionalism in there that is often more professional than shown by the politicians. But in terms of Britain's preparedness, by the way, no, we were quite unprepared in ways which we could have been. Why didn't we have masks? The government was saying for months you don't need a mask. Was the reason that we didn't need a mask, or simply that we hadn't got any? So there's no point in telling people to get something that they can't get anyway. I think also, though, if you look at the way on the one question I'd have, which is on the hospitals, the Nightingale hospitals, why didn't they open them? Because what we now know is loads of people that should have had other treatments didn't get them because of COVID. So why didn't they open the other COVID hospitals? I really don't know that.
Do you think, Adrian, that this would be that one, there is a better way. There surely is a better way of handling this that the government either didn't do or couldn't do. And if it's that they couldn't do it, do you think that's basically because of investment in the NHS?
I wouldn't put it in that broader picture investment in the NHS, but I would say that we were completely unready. Why didn't we have face masks? By the way, I think when we had you could make that broader point, though. I believe when we had 5,000 intensive care beds, the Germans had 58,000 intensive care beds. So that reflects a level of care perhaps in Germany that we don't have here. But, you do wonder sometimes if we're spending monies in the right ways. One thing I was saying earlier on, I still think we have a government for the old. So while we were short of PPE and so forth, we were still giving pensioners, of which I'm one, by the way, still giving pensioners what Sunak is trying to get rid of and what Johnson won't get rid of, which is the triple lock, because we have a government of the old. And, we could have done that. Why didn't we? We could have saved billions on that and spent it on PPE instead. But, because we have a government of the old, then they look after that old constituency in ways that are quite unnecessary.
I don't know Rishi Sunak would take kindly to being called old. I think he's barely turned 40.
No. Rishi Sunak said he wanted to get rid of the triple lock.
Yeah, he does. Absolutely.
And he's right.
But I think you're right, and I think he is right, that the triple lock does need to be looked at very, very, very quickly.
Billions a year, and they could have spent that on masks. They could have bought more intensive care beds, but they didn't. Good. Right. Why is that a good decision?
Adrian, appreciate the call. Thank you. 0345 6060 973. It was political decision-making that perhaps was the final sign-off to get the contingency in place to deal with what was deemed a top-tier threat to this country. What was the politics of those decisions? How much did perhaps austerity play into it? 0345 6060 973. I wonder what you made of some of the answers that Sir Mark Sedwill had for what was going on at the heart of government when this crisis was hitting our shores. We'll come to more of your calls in a few moments' time. Tom Swarbrick here, Swarbrick on Sunday, 11:30. News headlines. Here's Thomas Watts.
Speaking to LBC, a cabinet minister has confirmed a change to coronavirus isolation rules is under consideration. The 2-week quarantine for contacts of those who test positive could be cut to 10 or 7 days. Downing Street's confirmed post-Brexit trade talks in London have been extended until Wednesday. Brussels chief negotiator Michel Barnier had been due to go home today after resuming negotiations with Lord Frost earlier in the week. The Welsh Government's agreed to review a ban on the sale of non-essential items in supermarkets. Retailers have been asked to stop selling products such as clothes and books to level the playing field for shops ordered to shut. And the weather, a mix of sunny intervals and rain, the heaviest showers with hail and thunder in the west and south, a high of 13 Celsius.
This is LBC. This is LBC, Swarbrick on Sunday, with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster. Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850.
Very good morning to you. Got a text here on 84850 based on what we just heard from Sir Mark Sedwill this morning. Tom, really interesting. We need to reflect upon the prioritisation of other political investment over the highest issues in the risk register, which is the thing that was telling the government that the pandemic was at the top national risk for many years, actually. So there was good warning about it. Here's Angela on 84850. Tom, Nightingale hospitals do not work. There is no point having beds with ventilators if they have no dialysis machines. We needed one for practically every patient on ITU. The meds were also isolated and there are not enough qualified staff to run them. A vanity project, propaganda, call it what you will, says Angela, senior clinical nurse in London. Nigel's on 84850. Tom, this country's response was a classic just-in-time response. This is partially due to greed and partially due to logistics, with it being a relatively small manufacturing country. Anders is in Vienna this morning. Hi there, Anders.
Hello. There's something that everyone's slightly getting wrong. Let's cast our minds back to the mid-2000s. You were in government, so you could probably tell me exactly when. WHO issued, pandemic warnings. Okay, and the pandemic warnings were for a SARS-based disease and a flu-based disease. Okay, now you're saying pandemic as if it's just one giant pandemic, but there were two very specific diseases. Now, the government's response was correct for a flu pandemic. It was not correct for a SARS-based pandemic. So basically, the answer is, did the government get something wrong? Yes, they didn't plan for SARS. They only planned for flu. And when SARS hit, the language, this idea that, it could roll through the population, you're very unlikely to get herd immunity from SARS. This whole idea of washing your hands, the first response immediately, the first response in the messaging from government was for a flu-based pandemic, not a SARS-based pandemic.
So, Anders,
and that is the big failing.
I think you are right. The two documents that suggest that may have been the case is the 2011 influenza pandemic preparedness report, which prepared for an influenza-style pandemic and did come up with issues around keeping away and washing hands and things like that. But on mass gatherings, it was saying, mass gatherings can carry on, which is what happened at the start of this.
Because you get herd immunity from the flu, which you don't get from SARS.
But are we therefore saying that that government should be able to prepare for every possible outcome? I don't think we are, because it's not feasible.
I'm not saying the government should be prepared for every possible outcome, but if they're saying that there are likely to be two giant pandemics coming, one is going to be SARS, the other alternative is flu, it's a good idea to prepare for both just in case. You don't have to spend billions on, you spend billions on a bridge that was never built. You can spend maybe a couple of million on just, hiring some experts to figure out exactly what to do in the case of a national emergency.
I think that's right, but I think also the difficulty, and I think Sir Mark alluded to it there, is actually getting it done. One would be amazed to see just how much work internally, even at the very top of government, goes into having to drive the government machine to actually do stuff.
Of course, but this, of course, is the classic Dominic Cummings is going to come through and clean up government so that government works like an efficient machine. Government doesn't work like an efficient machine, and everybody knows this. But it was the mid-2000s this was first talked about. It's been almost 15 years since then, and you still only have one report afterwards. This is, come on.
We should have been, you sound a bit like Joe Biden there. Come on, man.
Well, I am an American citizen, and I am an American citizen, and I'm also going to be voting in the next couple of weeks by vote. And the other question is, if we are going to talk about Joe Biden, let's wait to see what Joe Biden has to say about the current administration, which is, to American minds, a classic European populist in the mold of an Orban, rather than the mold of Brexit Heza.
All right. Okay. Anders, thank you very much indeed. Colin's in Alton. Hiya, Colin.
Hi.
Hi, your thoughts?
Yes, I was just going back to this question of the supermarkets having to tie up the clothes divisions.
Yes.
It's really nothing to do with being fair to the other retailers. The issue is to try to stop people going out, and they do have to go out for food, and the supermarkets sell food. If they go out to buy clothes, then they shouldn't be going out at all because they've got enough clothes. And it's therefore just the fact that the supermarkets have decided to
But I want to buy some more clothes, Colin. I need to buy some more clothes for my children. Why can't I go to Asda and buy some clothes for them in Wales?
Over a period of time, you would be able to. You don't need to.
I want to do it today. I need to do it today because they are running out of... I genuinely had to do this yesterday. We had to buy the kids a load of clothes. They've run out of clothes. They've grown out of them. I want to go and do it in Asda in Wales now. Why am I not being allowed to take this seriously, wear my mask, be very careful about how I do it?
Because you are going out in order to buy clothes, and not many people do regard clothes as an essential for today.
But isn't that because the state has made...
It's a period while we try to get
I understand that.
Control.
But isn't that because the state has made a judgment to suggest that you're not really capable of taking this carefully and do this right, are you? That's what the state's judgment is, isn't it?
If you're going to leave... No, I'm not saying... I don't think that is correct. I think that what the state is saying is you must go out for essentials. I've just come back from being in Switzerland where I was in lockdown for a while, and all of the supermarkets which sell food and which had everybody going in, a queue up outside, separate divisions, in order to get the essentials. Get the essentials. And I think one of the burdens of the pandemic and the steps needed to be taken against and deferring the impact until we get a vaccine or whatever, is to stop people going out. And if you are saying you are going out to get clothes, I'm afraid to say that I think that not being able to is a consequence.
Let's not
to be taken.
Let's not just keep it at food. I mean, you can order food in. Let's get the delivery lorries going. Let's just say, Colin, the state can say you're never allowed out again. Listen, thank you for the call. We'll talk about that in more detail after the news at 12. Come to more of your calls before then. 0345 6060 973 is my number. I want to talk, though, about long COVID. This is something that many millions of people are continuing to suffer with, the long-term effects of having had coronavirus. And for the majority of sufferers, it manifests itself with symptoms that are brief and mild, but of course some are still struggling with the long-term effects for months on: breathlessness, exhaustion, pain persisting long after they have tested negative. The condition known as long COVID is having a debilitating effect on people's lives, with effects ranging from long-term shortness of breath to crippling fatigue. LBC's Tom Dunn has this report.
For thousands of people across the UK, the idea that the symptoms of the coronavirus last no more than a fortnight is simply paper talk. Long-form COVID patients will tell you they look very different from the typical portrait of a COVID-19 patient. But inside, it's been months of living with the virus with no real end in sight. Both Claire and Peter are now moving into month 7 of their fight.
I was just in bed for quite a few weeks, and over time my symptoms evolved. I have heart pain, palpitations, neurological type symptoms like pins and needles, pressure in my head, dizziness, issues with concentration. I couldn't even have a conversation with my parents for a while, for a couple of weeks, because it was so exhausting even to actually talk to anybody. Couldn't watch telly or listen to the radio even. It was all just too much for my brain and body to handle.
So I came home. I had struggled from that day with my memory. Both my short-term and long-term memory is pretty poor. Walking-wise, initially I could walk, and when I say initially, I'm talking within the first month, maybe a 6-minute walk. I'd have to stop 4 times maybe. I can now walk, well, my record so far is 22 minutes at a slow pace.
Researchers looking into long-form COVID have found that 1 in 20 people are still suffering with symptoms 8 weeks after initial diagnosis, and around 1 in 50 are still struggling after 3 months. The study by King's College London included data from over 4,000 COVID symptom study app users. Dr. Claire Steeves is one of the leads in this research.
What we've sort of shown is really the tip of the iceberg, but there are many, many people, as you say, who maybe didn't get tested initially, who have got long COVID symptoms, and they do need ongoing rehabilitation. And of course, as things go now, with the second wave coming, this is going to be an increasing problem. So it's really important that the government and the healthcare service get to grips with this, provide rehabilitation services, but importantly, think about preventative trials as well.
Although more research is welcome to those still adapting to life with the virus, it doesn't bring back what some have already lost due to it. Like Helen, who lost her bakery business in Bolton after she fell ill back at the beginning of March. She's barely been able to lift herself out of bed since first coming out of hospital.
I'd struggle some days to even get out of bed if I push myself too much through the fatigue or through the breathlessness, which with 2 kids kind of have no option half the time. I can find myself in bed for days afterwards. If I try and go for a walk at any point, I've come to realise that my body just doesn't want me to do that, because I'll just end up the next day in bed all day.
Well, it comes as other data from Public Health England suggests around 10% of people with COVID-19 who weren't admitted to hospital, like Claire, Peter and Helen, reported symptoms lasting more than 4 weeks. Health Secretary Matt Hancock confirmed earlier this week that long COVID specialist clinics are now being prepared and will be placed at locations across the UK from early next year.
LBC's Tom Dunn reporting on the effects of long COVID being suffered with by so many people actually who have got coronavirus or have had coronavirus. Their symptoms are continuing for some time to come. We'll take more of your calls in a few moments' time on the issues raised by Sir Mark Sedwill's interview. We'll talk about Wales after the news at 12 o'clock, and we'll speak to Sir Anthony Seldon as well, talking to me about what is needed to boost the economy and boost business growth. I'd be very interested to hear his thoughts as a chronicler of governments past and present about what he makes about how the government have handled this as well. Tom Swarbrick here on LBC. Swarbrick on Sunday. It's 11:46.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. LBC.
As of today, the Home Office confirms EU criminals could be barred from entering the UK under border rules designed to make the country safer. Policing Minister Kit Malthouse. How is this firmer?
Under these rules, anybody who's convicted of an offence and gets a sentence of over 12 months will be automatically barred, and we'll be able to have a look at the pattern of offending of those who have a sentence below 12 months to bar them too if we think there's reason to do so.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7. LBC. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Morning to you. To your calls momentarily. I want to speak to Sir Anthony Seldon first, though, historian, author of a major new booklet about the growth economy. Sir Anthony Seldon, welcome to the programme this morning. Thank you very much indeed for being there. Tell us about, we've been talking about the economy this morning, obviously, and what's required to try and get it back up on its feet. Tell us what you're suggesting.
Well, thanks, Tom. Good to be here. This is a real moment, isn't it, in the national economy, and what these small and medium-sized companies desperately need is equity funding, not more debt, but equity funding to allow them to power the growth in the British economy. This is about our future prosperity, future jobs, and this money is available. They need to have equity. We're looking at about 20,000 companies, all very successful growth companies with high growth. They're desperate, Tom, for the equity money to allow them to grow. And it needs to be patient money that's not going to demand very quick returns. It needs to be locally based, and it needs to be with the private sector leading this.
You've talked about £15 billion National Renewal Fund. Isn't this just another way of government picking winners again?
No, absolutely not, Tom. I mean, it's a good question, but no. This is about the private sector getting behind these companies. It's about getting the pension assets. There's £2.2 trillion in pension assets. It's about getting the insurance companies, about getting the quoted investment trust, private clients, and yes, a role for government. But government, what we need it to do, Tom, is not chuck in all the money itself. We need it to provide that permissive environment to liberalise, incentivise the private sector to get the cash, to get into the companies, the growth economy post-COVID and across the whole country. This makes perfect sense for government because with its commitment to the red wall areas, the Midlands, the North, we are talking in this booklet, the British Business Fund, and I, with Stephen Welton, co-author, it's about getting the money to the companies that most need it. They're desperate for it. The money's there. They need the equity funding.
We'll see if the people in the Treasury that I'm sure you can do some leaning on, Anthony, will be listening to your calls. Just on how government is dealing with all of this, I was speaking earlier to Sir Mark Sedwill, obviously former National Security Advisor, former head of the Civil Service, talking about the political decision-making behind building contingency into the state to deal with crises of this kind. I wonder what your view is of whether the state was prepared enough for a crisis like this.
No, it wasn't. But that's not about bashing necessarily the British government or even not bashing them at all. Governments the world over were not well enough prepared. Those in the Far East, which had to deal with previous epidemics more immediately, were better, including China. But, you know, in general, it's a symptom of our regularity of our elections that government's time span, they're very, very short term. They're thinking about how they're going to win the next general election. They're not thinking about the welfare, the well-being of the environment or the health and safety nearly long enough. So Mark said, well, absolutely right. Great cue to get him on the programme. We need government to be thinking not just about how do we get the current political party elected, but how can we care about all our interests and our children and our children's children interests, which, by the way, is exactly what this booklet is about, because it's thinking about the long-term health of the economy.
I wondered, just finally, very quickly, what that means then, if it is part and parcel of our actually quite short-termist democracy, that we have a vote every 5 years, it can all change again in 5 years' time, and boy, have we seen a lot of change over the last few years. What the solution to that is? Do we have elections every 7 years or 8 years, maybe?
Well, it used to be 7 years when Britain first became a democracy at the beginning, started to become a democracy at the beginning of the 18th century. Then it went down to 3 years. It was too regular. But in 1911, it went up to 5 years. I think that it's right to have them every 4 or 5 years, but it's about developing a statesman-like quality amongst our politicians. So they're not just mean, hungry people desperate for their own advantage and their party's advantage, but there's more of a sense of the common good. And that's really the difference between statespeople and mere short-termist politicians. There's that sense for the common welfare. It's seeing the good in the other political parties, in other opinions. It's not just this very narrow, rebarbative world that we've lived in. And this, of course, is a great opportunity for the Johnson government now.
Sir Anthony, many thanks for your time on the programme this morning. Sir Anthony Seldon, historian, author of this major new study about the growth economy, the $15 billion that is required in what they're calling a national renewal fund to target more than 20,000 growth economy companies to try and get us back up and running again. Let's speak to Susan, who's in Salisbury this morning. Welcome to the programme, Susan. What made you pick up the phone?
Hello. I couldn't let Mark Sedwill go unchallenged when he said that collective government was very efficient while Boris was in hospital with COVID. From my perspective, it was paralysed, and we couldn't wait to get him back, although I'm not a fan of his, because government appeared to be paralysed. That it couldn't make decisions in the time that the Prime Minister was in hospital? Without their head, they were lost.
Do you think that, I mean, Sir Mark said that the system worked very well, actually, underneath it all, and it was strong and robust, and people managed to go on and get things done. But you're right, if I guess just on the sort of the basics of it, if you take out the kind of charismatic leader, then things might fall away underneath a bit.
Yes. Well, I think this is a house of cards. I'm on the other side. So I think it's just a house of cards waiting to fall down.
When you say you're on the other side, what do you mean, Susan?
Well, I'm more left-leaning.
Right. You think it's a right-wing thing or centre-right thing that it didn't work?
Well, I agree with the last caller when he said that we need more long-term politics and people who aren't in it for themselves. And I'm afraid I believe the Tory party is in it very much for themselves, for their own glory and their own gain.
Well, I guess long-term planning and the ability to make those long-term decisions should come with a big majority. I mean, whether it was Tony Blair or Boris Johnson, who has a big majority, that should help, shouldn't it, in being able to take those tougher, longer-term decisions and plan for the future a bit more?
It should help, but I think their entire attitude is they're just mendacious and corrupt, self-interested, cronyist, morally bankrupt. These are some notes I jotted down the other day.
No, I was going to say what you really think, Susan.
Pardon?
Say what you really think.
I couldn't hear you.
No, don't worry. We got it. Susan, thank you very much indeed for the call. Here's Malcolm in Bodmin. Hi, Malcolm.
Hi, Tom. How are you? All right?
I'm well. Susan's not happy.
Tom, she's right in her main thrust. Tom, statistics can be read in many ways, interpreted in many ways. They never lie. On the Welsh government thing and the government here in England, Tom, a 14 or 21 day lockdown now, one in 3 months' time, one in 6 months' time, will stop the spread of the virus in total. If we have three 3-week lockdowns, the spread of
will
virus...
it? I mean, this is the problem, Malcolm, and I'm glad you raised it because we're coming on to it after the news. Is it going to actually stop the spread of the virus? Nicola Sturgeon wanted to have a 2-week circuit breaker or in parts of the country to lock down harder. That's now being extended. We've heard Labour talk about a 2 or 3 week circuit breaker, 2 or 3 weeks, some suggestion that maybe it would carry on. Is there a guarantee that this would work? We'll talk about that in more detail. We'll be joined by the former Secretary of State for Wales, Allin-Khan, after the news at 12.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at midday. People told to self-isolate by NHS Test and Trace could soon be required to do so for 7 days rather than a fortnight. Health officials are considering a change to the rules in England for close contacts of people who test positive for COVID-19. There are concerns about public compliance with the measures. Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis has told Swarbrick on Sunday on LBC that no final decision has been made.
How we deal with, how we live with COVID is changing as we learn more about it, as we see how it's developing. So they're always looking at these things. I think that's the right thing to do, because obviously we want to facilitate people getting back as quickly as they can if they've had to isolate, as whatever form of normality we can live within the restrictions we're living in. So it's right that the team keep these things under review.
Reports suggest plans are being made for frontline NHS staff to receive a COVID-19 vaccine within weeks. The Mail on Sunday says it's seen a staff memo referring to the start of an inoculation programme in early December. There's been no official timescale for the release of any vaccine. A ban on the sale of non-essential items in Welsh supermarkets during the firebreak lockdown there will be reviewed next week. Retailers have been asked to stop selling items such as clothes and books to level the playing field for shops ordered to shut. More than 50,000 people have signed a petition calling for the rule to be reversed. Speaking to Swarbrick on Sunday, Labour's Shadow Mental Health Minister Rosena Allin-Khan has welcomed the decision to reconsider the measures.
I think people have found it unusual, I'll be honest, but the Welsh Government are listening, which is more than what our government have been doing. And the Welsh Government, they have provided a really good financial package of support. They have a contact tracing rate of 90%, where we can't even make it to 68%. We think it's a really good thing that they are listening to their communities who have said that they're struggling with that.
Downing Street's confirmed post-Brexit trade talks in London have been extended until Wednesday. Brussels chief negotiator Michel Barnier had been due to go home today after resuming negotiations with Lord Frost earlier this week. And Lewis Hamilton could set an outright record for Formula One victories today. A finish in first place at the Portuguese Grand Prix would take his tally to 92, one ahead of Michael Schumacher. And the weather, a mix of sunny spells and rain, the heaviest showers with hail and thunder in the west and south this afternoon, a high of 13 Celsius. From Global's newsroom, I'm Thomas Watts.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC.
Very good afternoon to you. 3 minutes past 12 is the time. Tom Swarbrick here on LBC as we stride into Sunday afternoon. Hope we find you very well tuning in our way if you are on LBC, of course, or on YouTube, Twitter, Global Player, where you can watch us live as well. I want to talk about Wales. And I want to talk, the country. I want to talk about the way in which it has responded to coronavirus in the last few days. As you know, the Welsh leader, Labour leader Mark Drakeford, putting in this circuit breaker policy to try and get control of the virus. It's spreading in cities, Cardiff and Swansea and Newport. There are problems with the R rate there. In other parts of Wales, situation is very different. The R rate is much more in control. Case numbers are much lower than they are in other parts of the country, but nevertheless, a countrywide circuit breaker has been brought in to the point where we have seen a ban on supermarkets selling non-essential items. We now know that is going to be reviewed for what they're calling, the Welsh Government is calling clarity, after a weekend that has seen supermarket shelves had plastic taping put over them, where children's clothing has been deemed as non-essential, therefore it has been wrapped up. But the bottle of vodka that is lying next to it that you can buy in the supermarkets has been deemed essential. I wonder if this is a sign that, for reasons that are possibly incredibly well-intentioned, we are slightly losing our minds here about this. Where is the science to say, actually, if you go into a supermarket to buy clothes for your kids that is contributing to the spread of the disease? Where is the science to say, actually, economically too, it makes sense to cover up the clothing that you could buy in one of these supermarkets for your kids and therefore not require you to go out to the supermarket? Because this is going to have a massive effect on businesses in Wales, shops that do sell apparently non-essential goods. Guess what? They're going to lose out again to companies like Amazon and others where you can just order it and they'll bring it to your door. Is that the point, though, of the measures that are being brought in? That actually people are incentivized not to go out to buy these kinds of goods. They'll nevertheless order them online and can get them that way. If that's the case, why have shops open at all? Just do it for food. Just don't allow anyone to go into a supermarket if you're worried about people going into the supermarket and spreading this thing around. Just say, OK, well, we'll do it online from now on. 0345 6060 973 if you are in Wales and you are having to go to the supermarket later on, or you're having to do the Sunday shop and you're not going to be able to get the stationery. I mean, you thought that was a good idea that you're not allowed to get. I'd love to hear from you this morning. 0345, or this afternoon, 0345 6060 973. 12:05, Alan Cairns is the former Secretary of State for Wales. He is also the Conservative MP for the Vale of Glamorgan. Thank you very much for coming on the programme this afternoon, Mr. Cairns. Are we losing our minds? What's going on here?
Well, thanks, Tom, and it's good to talk to you, and thank you for highlighting this issue, because this has generated a huge amount of emails and reactions on social media, and I think the principle is about the one-size-fits-all. There's no doubt, and that the government, or the Welsh Government, claim that they know better than individuals but are not prepared to share the science. So there are some parts of Wales where the infection rate, as you rightly pointed out, is exceptionally low. It's less than 30 per 100,000 over the last 7-day rolling average. And then there are other parts of Wales well in excess of 300 or even 400 in some local communities. Out of 100,000 people over the last 7 days. But no matter where you live, you're under the same restriction. And to add insult to injury, you're not even allowed to buy what they deem to be non-essential items. Now, the legislation itself doesn't list what they are. There's some mentions of electrical goods and clothes and so on. But I've seen reports on social media and one specific email sent to me of a foster carer who needed to be able to source items quite late in the day, but for a child, but was in that position where they weren't able to get them because they were deemed non-essential. So it's the one size fits all, but it's also them deeming what is essential and what is not. And this is a dangerous precedent of socialism.
Well, I guess we'll come back to that in a minute, but I guess the Welsh Government is not saying you cannot get these items at all. You can still get them. You just have to go a different way of getting them. You can order them online.
Well, the defence they're using to this nonsensical policy is that they're seeking to protect the high street. But you don't protect the high street by stopping someone's shop elsewhere. You need to introduce policies that absolutely support the high street. So I can understand what their objective is, but it's not going to achieve anything, because the only winner in this is Amazon, because they are the ones that I'll make an order today and something will arrive tomorrow. And the shop on the high street still isn't able to sell, but nor is the other shop that is allowed to open because they sell food. They're not allowed to sell items either. But I'd also add, those supermarkets employ large numbers of people. If all of a sudden you're only 50% of the floor space of a supermarket can be available because 50% of the items are deemed non-essential, then those people, they won't need, clearly, so many people working those shifts. So whether that is overtime, whether that is reducing recruitment, whatever it might be, it's having a negative effect on those families. But it also has a major negative effect on Wales. If I was an investor, I would be looking to see how the Welsh Government are treating the private sector, are treating business and the communities, and I'd sort of raise an eyebrow or two.
I want to come back to the point you just made about this being a dangerous precedent of socialism. In what way?
Well, this is where the one government, a public administration, is telling you what you can and cannot do, not because of the science has been presented and there's a logic behind it, so people would buy into the rationale. It's just because they deemed it inappropriate. So there is some science.
There is a logic, though, isn't there? There's a logic that that many people don't agree with, but there is a logic. It's trying to stop more people coming into an area where they could spread the disease.
Well, there's some science out there, and the disease transmits within a household is right at the top of the league table. Then it's between households is the next, and then you come right down the league table to shops, and that is at the very low end. So that's precisely the point I'm getting at. This one-size-fits-all, I would say in my constituency that I think the high street could be open. They'd introduce proper safeguards. The infection rate is relatively low. It's around 50 per 100,000 on a 7-day rolling average. So my constituency, the high street could remain open. But because it's a one-size-fits-all, the Welsh Government have taken that view, but to add insult to injury, they are now telling people what they can buy and what they can't buy.
Boris Johnson's government closed non-essential shops for a long period of time. Is that a precedent of socialism?
No, because we didn't understand the science at that stage. Clearly, in March, there was a logic behind it because you need to take precautionary approach because we didn't know how the virus spread, what the incubation period was, and I think it was absolutely the right thing to do. It may well be that closing the shops is the right thing to do in some of these communities where the infection rate is very, very high. But I would say, now that we know much more about the disease... But if shops are areas that don't have the spread,
if shops are areas where the spread isn't that great, what would be the point of closing them even in areas where there is a high infection rate?
Well, the point I'm getting at, everything has got to be proportionate. It's got to be proportionate to the science, but it's also got to be proportionate to the risk, because there's a knock-on effect on this in terms of, for example, you're not allowed to buy, I've been looking at the list of some sort of guidance that they've issued, you're not allowed to buy garden equipment. Well, going into someone's garden, if they're lucky enough to have a garden, will be important to their fitness, their well-being, their mental health within your own household. But you're not allowed to go and get anything to use or add or do in the garden according to their rules. So the point I'm getting at is that when we know the science, more about the science as we do now compared to March, then it's quite obvious that we can make different judgments and different decisions, and they will be different in different areas according to the risk profile of transmission.
So things like
taking a one-size-fits-all is wholly inappropriate.
The one-size-fits-all that might say that gyms in certain parts of the country that are in Tier 3 lockdown should close. Do you think that is a one-size-fits-all that needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis?
It needs to be judged according to the environment and according to the risk within a particular community. So there's been a great campaign in Liverpool, for example, where after protests from the community, there was a pragmatic approach in order to open them. That's a similar campaign that's developing in Wales, because as I highlighted that league table, where households and then between households is at the top of the tree, and then you come right down to the bottom, shops and gyms are right down at the bottom of the league table.
I just come back to that precedent of socialism point, Alan. It may well have been that scientifically it was you didn't need to shut gyms if you were going into Tier 3 because of the transfer or lack of transfer of illnesses or of the virus within a gym. I'm just interested in whether you think that was Boris Johnson or whomever straying too close for your liking to dangerous precedents of socialism.
Well, you've got to judge it according to the local environment. So let me give you a simple example. Take it in relation to a shop. Now, back in March, when there was no PPE, there weren't any plastic screens, people didn't wear face masks, then clearly the risks were higher then. Now that shopkeepers have invested in significant elements of PPE, we understand it, we keep distances, there's one way in, one way out, they limit the number of people that can go to a shop. That then has managed the risk accordingly, or managed the circumstance of the risk that's appropriate. So therefore, going into a shop now is much safer and more appropriate than it would have been back in March. Now, clearly, in gyms,
same with gyms.
Exactly, providing, depending on what the infection rate is locally and what mitigation you can introduce. So if there are appropriate mitigations either within the gym itself or within the environment, because you're changing another policy, it might be associated with schools, with soft play, with whatever it might be, you've got everything you do increases the risk, but it's about being proportionate to that, and that's the issue. So that if you're opening shops, then you might need to think a little bit differently in some other area where the risk might transmit itself. So it's about a balance all the time, and that's exactly the point I'm making. It's the socialist structure where one size fits all, they know better, rather than following the science as my constituents are calling for.
All right. Alan Cairns, former Secretary of State for Wales, Conservative MP for the Vale of Glamorgan. Thank you very much indeed for your time. We'll see how much longer this ban on non-essential items continues for in Wales. Again, if you are in Wales, do you think there is a logic that you understand, a science that you trust, that goes behind some of these decisions? You know that it's best if you don't meet with people in confined areas. One of those confined areas is a supermarket. If you can go and get your food, that's great, but everything else, that needs to be put a halt to, even if it means, and you can see the, I don't know why I'm laughing about it, but you can see the pictures online of what, black and white tape going over the card part of a newsagent, that you're not allowed to buy greetings cards. It just feels... It's amazing how we've gone from a global pandemic that affects all the 180 plus countries around the world to now to the point where you can't walk into a Tesco's in Wales and buy a card for your mum to say happy birthday. It feels like we've gone a long way from the real concern of what this virus was doing to us and got to a level now of micromanaging, which is just completely inappropriate. 0345 6060 973. Come to your calls in just a moment. Tom Swarbrick here, 12:15.
This is LBC. This is LBC, Swarbrick on Sunday, with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster. Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850.
Talking about what on earth is going on in Wales this weekend when it comes to stopping people from buying non-essential or items deemed non-essential from supermarkets as a result of the lockdown. Text here on 84850. Supermarkets can cope, small local stores cannot. The restrictions in Wales are not about anything to do with health. It's to help other businesses that have had to close that sell the same things. says this texter. We'll speak to the Welsh lead at the Police Federation of England and Wales in just a moment. Let's speak to Dave, who's in Caerphilly this afternoon. Hi there, Dave.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. What do you make of it?
Well, I lost track of it when he started taking the right, usurping the right to categorise other countries as dangers and enforcing the quarantine. Alongside,
who are we talking about here, Dave? Are we talking about Mark Drakeford?
Yeah, I mean, this is
right,
it.
Okay.
I mean, you've got to remember, Mark Drakeford is a Labour leader kept in power by a Lib Dem. I mean, without Kirsty Williams, he hasn't got a majority.
Mm-hmm. And you think that plays into his response to coronavirus? How?
Yeah, it is a question of making a big splash, doing things just because he can without any basis in fact or science or logic.
Do you not think, though, Dave, that he's got a logic there, that he wants to stop people from spreading this about in supermarkets, so he's stopping going there for no good reason, in his view, which is to buy kids' clothes or to buy pens and stationery and what have you?
Well, it is a fairness to the shops that have been forced to close.
Yeah.
But, I mean, well, why have they been forced to close? I mean, what we need is enforcement of the social distancing and the hygiene and the mask.
But you don't think, Dave, he's acting for any other reason other than what? He's drunk on power?
Yeah, this is it. It started with the usurping of powers to categorise countries.
I don't think that's right. I think he's trying to do what he thinks is the best way forward for the country that he's trying to manage, but it's just a very bizarre and possibly wrong-headed way of doing it.
Well, I mean, that is how you think of it, but that's another way of saying the same thing. He's doing things because he can, which is the sign of a despot.
Oh, wow, Dave, he's despotic now.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is it. I mean,
he's a dictator, is he?
I think he's going that way, yes.
Drakeford the dictator, Dave, come on.
No, well, I mean, why else would he have not banned English people from coming into Wales when the government...
Well, they would say that he's trying to stop the spread of coronavirus in Wales, so he's trying to do the right thing by the people of Wales and not expose them to more of it. But Dave, you clearly think he's gone down a dark path. I appreciate the call. Thank you. 0345 6060 973 is the number. Come to more of your calls in a sec. Let's turn to Mark Bliesdale, who is the Welsh lead at the Police Federation of England and Wales. Thank you for coming on the programme this afternoon, Mr. Bliesdale. How difficult is this going to be to police, this arrangement in supermarkets?
Well, in reality, this is very similar to the situation when face masks were to be worn on public transport in Wales. At that time, the Chief Constable said, we support what the government's trying to do because it's there to help control the pandemic, but that is for the bus operators to manage. So this is very similar, really. This is for the shopkeepers to manage, and the local authority are actually the authority that oversee the way shops are run and whether that's safe for the public or not.
We've seen some videos already of disobedience, if you want to call it that, that's going on in supermarkets. Got people going in there and ripping the plastic off the shelves that would otherwise be open to be able to buy things from. Do you worry about that discontent showing itself more now as these measures become even more, I'm going to use the word ludicrous, but you might describe it as something else?
I mean, the measures have been put in place by the government and are based on must be based on some scientific evidence to try and stop people moving around and transferring the virus. So the message really for the public should be, and the messaging that should come from government is that we've set the measures out that you must stay at home, and the only reason that you need to go out, well, there's a limited number of reasons that you need to go out, and those are for sort of essential supplies and for food. So that's really.
But are you worried about people not listening to that?
Well, I would imagine that the longer this goes on, there is going to be some, and it's been quoted as being COVID fatigue, where people are. I think that the difficulty is the message has still got to be very clear as to what people can and cannot do and why they're being asked to do it. And that's maybe where this hasn't been working, that the messaging isn't clear from the government.
it's the why they're being asked, as well as the fact that they can't go and buy a pen and a bit of paper from a supermarket. It's the why they're being asked to do that that's so critical. I want to play you this, if I can, Mr. Bliesdale. We spoke to the former Secretary of State for Wales a few moments ago. Here's what Alan Cairns had to say. Take a listen.
No matter where you live, you're under the same restriction. And to add insult to injury, you're not even allowed to buy what they deem to be non-essential items. Now, the legislation itself doesn't list what they are. There's some mentions of electrical goods and clothes and so on. But I've had seen reports on social media and one specific email sent to me of a foster carer who needed to be able to source items quite late in the day, but for a child, but was in that position where they weren't able to get them because they were deemed non-essential. So it's the one size fits all, but it's also them deeming what is essential and what is not. And this is a dangerous precedent of socialism.
It's the former Secretary of State of Wales a few moments ago. On the point he was making about some of the people and the way they're being impacted on this, I mean, what would the police do to a foster mum or anybody else who's desperately trying to get some clothes for the children that are in their care and yet are having to go to a supermarket? What would the police do about that?
I mean, if I was an operational police officer at the time and I was asked to do that, I would be contacting a local shop to see whether they would provide that for nothing. A practical solution. I think the difficulty you've got here, and there was
you try and get it for free. You try and ask the supermarket, listen, guys, we've got a real problem here. Let's try and help her out. Maybe we can, I don't know, pay for it a different way or pay later, put it on the tab. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the point is that, as a Welsh Office Minister this morning, an Assembly Minister this morning said, is very difficult to draft perfect legislation. So I do understand there will be times when legislation is drafted and there were some unintended consequences, and there will always be that narrow group of people in these circumstances that you've and Mr. Cairns has just mentioned, where I couldn't see a court deciding to prosecute those people at the end of the day. So we would have to find some practical solution to it at the time. Where the police and police officers and those officers that I represent are perhaps getting caught in the middle of this is that, yes, feelings are running high. And
so there's no punishment, really?
Punishment for the shopkeeper?
If it's not going to... Yeah, if it's not... Well, no, for the people who are breaking these rules, if it's not going to go to court, if, as you say, the police are just having to contend with so much that's going on, then if the rules have no consequence, if there's no enforcement of them, are they going to be followed?
I mean, that isn't the way that officers across Wales have been asked to interpret the law and to put it into action, because they will always use a scaled approach to any bits of the legislation. First of all, explaining why it's in place and asking people to change their behaviour, and enforcement is always going to be a last option, and that is a general policing principle.
Which, as you've described, may well involve the police officer going to ask the supermarket if they can buy it for the person who needs it, perhaps. Extraordinary. Mark, thank you. Mark Bliesdale, you're the Welsh lead at the Police Federation of England and Wales. Good to have you on. Thank you. Let's go to Neath in South Wales. Here's Kevin this afternoon. Are you, Kevin?
Hello there. How are you doing?
I'm very well, sir. How are you?
Yeah, well, I'm not happy, man, and neither is half of Wales or 3/4 of Wales. You keep calling the Welsh Assembly a government. It's not a government. It is not a government. The Welsh people have never voted for it. We do for a vote next year. We all know where he's going, the way he's carrying on.
I see. Right. You're going to say Mark Drakeford's going to reap the whirlwind, is he?
And everybody else, same as on the news, you're calling it a government. It is not a government.
Well, it's a administration, Kevin, that you and your fellow Welshmen have voted for in enough numbers anyway to give it the authority that it has. Kevin, are you saying that this is no longer an authority that you wish to follow because of the way in which these rules are being implemented, sir?
Yes, he is they spelled his name wrong. It should be Drip Ford. Excuse the language.
Dripford.
Dripford. He is a blinking drip. No other word for that man. He's power hungry. He's calling himself a Welsh government. The newscasters, and every time he's on TV, he talks from his podium as if he's from the United States with two flags behind him. And the camera zoomed around. There's no Joe Public there. He will not face the public. I wish you had him on your programme and I can ask him a few questions. Do you know what, man?
We'd love to get him on again, Kevin. I'd love to get him on. We're trying to get him on this weekend, but he's clearly very busy having to deal with all the stationary problems.
He won't come on.
Let me put this to you, Kevin. There's been a bit of impetus recently from the Abolish the Welsh Assembly Party.
Yeah.
What do you make of that? Do you think that's going to increase now?
It can't come quick enough. And he's given. Do you know what he's done? He's given 60. The voting age was 18 and drinking and all the rest of it. Now Dripford and his gang have brought that age down now to 16-year-old children who are entitled to go and vote. Now, come on.
You're livid, Kevin. I can hear that you are pretty livid about all this.
My government is the UK Boris Johnson government. That's my government. And for Dripford and his bloody bunch of cowboys, they will go. I'm telling you now.
Kevin, careful on the language, Kevin. This is a family show. Careful on the language, Kevin. Thank you very much indeed for the call. Thank you for the call. I don't think if Mr. Drakeford knocks on Kevin's door at the next round of elections that he's going to get much of a positive response from Kevin down there in Neath. 0345 6060 973 is my number. Do you understand the reasons why you're being asked to avoid going to supermarkets to buy certain deemed non-essential goods? Do you understand the scientific underpinning for that? It's been well explained, and you think that it is logical and necessary, do you? We'll take more of your calls in a few moments. We'll talk too about the congestion charge, why the row over the congestion charge expansion could tear London apart. We'll bring you details on that in the next few moments as well. Tom Swarbrick here, Swarbrick on Sunday, 12:31. News headlines now. Here's Tim Humphrey.
A cabinet minister's confirmed to LBC a change to coronavirus isolation rules is under consideration. The 2-week self-isolation requirement for contacts of those who test positive could be cut to 10 or even 7 days. The Welsh Government's agreed to review a ban on the sale of non-essential items in supermarkets. Retailers still open during the lockdown there have been asked to stop selling items like clothes, books and electrical goods to level the playing field for shops that have been ordered to shut. Downing Street's confirmed post-Brexit trade talks in London have been extended until Wednesday. Brussels chief negotiator Michel Barnier had been due to go home today after restarting negotiations with Lord Frost earlier this week. The weather, a mixture of sunny intervals and rain. The heaviest showers with hail and thunder will be in the west and the south, a high of 13.
LBC Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
We are just 9 days out from hopefully from a result in the American election, but you never know with the way it's going at the moment. We'll talk about the details of the campaigns in just a few moments. We'll be in Washington in a sec. I want to go to Carmarthen first. Here's Jeff. Hiya, Jeff.
Hello, Tom. Thanks for taking my call.
You are more than welcome. What do you make of the policies introduced by Mr. Drake?
I've never heard so much lunacy on your show in all my life. People worrying about buying a kettle for 17 days. I mean, we've got an Argos here in Carmarthen. I was in Morrison's last night. Everyone's wearing masks, social distance, everyone calm, obeying the rules. We've got to fight this virus, get it down, and possibly we can have our grandson from Cardiff come to stay with us at Christmas. That's what this is all about. And all this... Well, what it is English racism. And it's been getting worse and worse over the last few months with the English saying, we can't come into Wales, and how can they tell us what to do? Rubbish. They're just trying to control a pandemic.
Hang on, English racism. All the people that have been railing against this so far, Jeff, have been from Wales.
Well, I hear my partner's Welsh, so she speaks Welsh, and she gets so much abuse from the English online all the time coming in. I mean, this is utter lunacy.
Well, I'm sorry, there's nobody who is excusing. There's nobody who's excusing that kind of abuse. But I think the idea to suggest that that English people are taking a quizzical look at this because it's racist. We had
one of your ministers on Andrew Marr this morning calling us Welsh socialists. I mean, that comes from one of the most right-wing extreme governments they've ever had in Westminster, accusing us of socialism. I mean, it's pure nonsense, utter nonsense. I mean, yesterday, the Green Party joined with Plaid Cymru. They're all supporting Mark Dreyfus. Mm-hmm. So the idea that he's some sort of dictator, which one of your earlier callers suggests, is utter nonsense.
Well, you've had the former Secretary of State... You had the former Secretary of State of Wales on this programme saying that it was a founding principle of socialism. This
yes, and what's it
dangerous?
About? He's a Brexit-supporting right-wing extremist who's trying to put tariffs on Welsh lamb. I mean, this is what it's really about, isn't it? This whole thing has come about
language around Jeff. Let's keep it convivial. Let's keep it cool.
Well, I'm just angry at this utter nonsense that people can't buy a kettle. You know, get onto your line, go to Argos and get a kettle if it's broken. If you can't get a spade for your garden, then get onto Argos and get a spade delivered. But frankly, you were given a week to get it in.
With respect.
Yeah, I mean, so he was saying your previous caller was talking about gardening. Utter nonsense. You know, if you haven't got a spade for your garden...
It is more than just the spade. This is not just about the kettle, even though the shops that sell some of those are shut as well. This is about individual freedoms and the fact that the government is making a decision on behalf of people that they just can't be trusted to do this sensibly.
When Mark Dreyfus brought in the alcohol curfew of 10 o'clock in Wales, we had a much more, instead of the hard line, throw everyone out at 10 o'clock, Mark Dreyfus agreed, no, we just stop serving at 10 o'clock and then let people gradually come out of the pubs. And I'm sure if someone needs an emergency for their baby or something, all they've got to do is go into a supermarket and say, look, I've got a bit of emergency, can't get it. Everyone's sensible in Wales. We're not like they are in England.
Hang on, let's not start getting into mass generalisations like all the...
I know what's going on there. It's turning up to lunacy with this QAnon nonsense they keep coming up with online.
Jeff, I don't think sweeping generalisations are very helpful here. But listen, thank you for your calm, collected, measured call. 0345 6060 973 is the number. Let's turn to the rolling tragicomedy that is the United States of America right now. Anita Kumar joins us, Washington correspondent and associate editor at Politico. Thank you very much for joining the programme this afternoon. We're 9 days out. Tell us how campaigning has gone in the last few days, certainly since that debate took place.
Sure. President Trump really feels like he did a good job at that debate, sort of had some momentum, and he is doing what he did in 2016, which is just traveling around the country and doing as many rallies as possible. Yesterday, he was in 4 different places. He's going to continue to hit all the swing states until November 3rd. But he's mostly going to places that he won last time. So he's not trying to expand the map as much as we had been thinking he would be doing. Joe Biden's also doing what he's been doing, which is sort of low-key campaigning, maybe visiting a state a day, if that much. He's really looking at small events because of the coronavirus pandemic. And, obviously he is ahead in the polls, so he's trying to keep that going.
So the small events, because of the pandemic, one can understand. But I wonder if there is a political incentive to do smaller, slightly below the radar events. One, because Barack Obama is clearly now out there front and centre doing a lot of the heavy lifting for him. And secondly, because the only way in which you make a mistake at this stage is to offer the mistake up. So if you're not seen anywhere, you can't really make a mistake.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, definitely there is some concern from some Democrats that he just needs to keep doing what he's doing, not make a gaffe, not make a mistake. There was something that happened at the debate the other day, their last debate, where some Republicans have kind of pounced on him for saying something about how he was transitioning, or he would want to transition away from oil drilling. And so, the less he talks, the less likely something like that is to happen. But he's also trying to send a message that, he is taking the coronavirus seriously. He doesn't think there should be good, big crowds. He is wearing a face mask. He's really trying to contrast President Trump with that message.
Yeah. Has he given an answer yet, Joe Biden, about whether he would pack the Supreme Court?
He has finally said, after not saying anything, he's finally said that if he wins, that he would put a group together, sort of a commission to study that, not packing the court, but a variety of other things to do to the Supreme Court.
Right. And Donald Trump's, as we enter the last straight, his final sort of big ticket campaigning item, or his big sort of attack on Joe Biden, is what exactly? Because that campaign has been spilling around looking for an attack line from everywhere. It's been there've been very different messages at all times. What has he settled on, or hasn't he?
You're so right. That's that's typical Donald Trump. There isn't one message, and actually there are a lot of Republicans that are frustrated about that. They feel like there should be one closing message. They feel like there should have been one message the entire time. They wish that he had concentrated more and focused more on the economy. Obviously, it's not doing well now, but it was doing pretty well before the pandemic. They want him to say, look, I did it once, I can do it again. He is saying that, but he's also saying about 10 other things. So, there's not one coherent message going into this last week.
Okay. Anita Kumar, what a last week it's going to be. Thank you very much indeed for your time this afternoon. White House correspondent and associate editor at Politico. 12:42, here's Rianne in Cardiff. Welcome to the programme, Rianne. What made you pick up the phone?
Thank you. It was your last but one caller, to be honest. I feel like we should be grateful for the actions that Mark Sedwill has taken on our behalf. I feel safer that I live in Wales. I moved to London a few years ago, lived there for 12 years, come home to live now, and I feel like he's a more responsible leader, to be honest, than Boris Johnson. And I think he's acted decisively. Sorry. Responsible in the sense that he has taken decisions away from individual members of the public to decide when and how they go to the shops, and made the decision for them. However, I know I do sympathise a little bit with that sentiment, but our liberties are... sorry, I'm a first-time caller. I haven't done this before. That's all right, don't worry. Our liberties are often limited. I mean, if you owned a Lamborghini, you might quite like to drive more than 30 miles an hour. A lot of Cardiff now, 20 miles an hour. But, in order to protect people, you wouldn't do that, would you? So I have to say, completely Rianne, free to do whatever we want. Yeah. And if this is going to protect our health, and that's what a good leader should do, or at least one of the things they should do, is protect public health. Surely. Absolutely. But of course, there's a balancing act, isn't there? Public health means a lot of things, actually. It doesn't just mean protection from the coronavirus. Like mental health all sorts of other health issues, mental health, but also to an extent economic health, which is also an issue in playing into people's physical well-being too, as we know. Just finally on this then, Mark Drakeford is a better leader because he takes more decisive decisions about how to manage this. I think If this scenario that you're in at the moment in Wales lasted for longer than 17 days because the R hadn't come down enough for Mark Drakeford's liking, would you accept that? Would you accept that until R comes below a certain level, you're going to have to live like this? I think they need to maybe look at emphasis on other things. For example, the students. So you've got parts of Wales like Aberystwyth where the local population is almost doubled when the students are there. So maybe we need to look at keeping them at home and maybe paying the accommodation fees. I don't know. Would that be more economical than paying for businesses to remain shut? I don't know. I think it's really difficult.
Yeah, oh God, definitely it's difficult. Listen, Rhiann, thank you so much for your call. Good first-time call. Make sure it's not your last. Thank you for it. 0345 6060 973 is the number. More in just a moment. 12:45.
Coming up at 1 on LBC, Majid Nawaz.
A Welsh Cabinet Minister has said that a second Wales-wide lockdown in the new year is looking increasingly likely. Really? Does this go too far or not far enough?
Majid Nawaz on LBC. This is LBC, Swarbrick on Sunday, with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster.
Talk in a moment about the congestion charge in London. The suggestion from central government to the Mayor of London is that he is going to need to think about putting up the congestion charge, or at least expanding the congestion charge zone massively in order to help try and bail out TfL. We'll talk about that in a few moments' time. Let's go to Eleanor first in Anglesey in North Wales this afternoon. Hi, Eleanor.
Hiya, good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for taking my call. First thing I'd like to say is that I am supporting Mark Drakeford, even though I work in retail and our shop is closed for 17 days. even though I'm in an area where there's low transmission, Anglesey that is, and also because Mark Bliesdale has explained clearly that the R rate will not come down below 1 over the 2 weeks of the lockdown because of the time lag. He has given us assurances that we're up and running again on the 9th of November, and over the following couple of weeks they will look at the impact of the lockdown and make assessments based on that. He has taken advice from the UK SAGE and his own medical or health and pandemic experts in Wales. He is doing an excellent job. He is cool, calm, collected. He answers questions on his regular press conferences, at which the LBC reporter is often featured, in a clear and concise manner, and I have full confidence in him. However, I should say that I should say I have never voted Labour in my life. Okay.
Oh, interesting. I'm just interested, Eleanor, given what you do in the area that you do it in, which, as you say, has low case rates. If it is the case, unfortunately, that this experiment that's being done on the whole of Wales turns out not to have driven the R rate down enough, would you be okay with, as I think is being suggested by Welsh ministers, a second version of this sometime in the new year, perhaps?
I think what would be interesting is to see how the results in Wales compare with the results in England, where you've had areas in some form of lockdown for weeks and weeks and weeks, and the R rate is continuing to rise. So I think the whole statistical analysis would be interested. But if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes.
All right, Eleanor, I'm grateful to you for your call. Thank you very much indeed for it. Comes to more of them in just a moment. 12:52 is the time. Let's speak to Sian Berry, who is the Green candidate for Mayor of London, co-leader of the Green Party. Morning to you, Sian. Thank you for coming on the programme. I want to ask you about this congestion charge decision that the Mayor of London has got now as to whether or not to extend it much, much wider, include much of London in it. I wonder if you think that is a good way forward for the Mayor to try and get the money for TfL.
No, I don't. And you might be surprised to hear me say that as a Green. But actually, we've been developing and thinking about having a more sophisticated congestion charging regime in London for many, many years. I've just been looking at my 2008 manifesto. I stood for mayor in 2008. There I'm saying, basically, an ever-expanding congestion charge zone will become self-defeating. So we need to work on developing more sophisticated solutions for road charging in the future. And that is a mile-by-mile charge, effectively, one that charges you for actually the driving that you do. I think people in London are right to point out that a £15 charge for most of the city, that's a flat fee for the whole day, would be unfair on people who drive just a tiny amount during that day.
Yeah, the school run
charging,
or whatever,
yeah, exactly. We need to be charging really based on what damage people cause, and that means basing it on emissions as well, and replacing the flat charge we currently have for the ultra emission zone as well. That is what we've been calling for, like I say, 12 years at the very least.
Yes. So what kind of thing then, Sian, are we talking about? What kind of charges are we talking about based on the amount of time you spend driving or the length that you go to? What sort of charges would people be looking at?
I think a mile-by-mile charge based on the emissions of your vehicle. And also you can be sophisticated about this. You can charge based on the time of day. You can try to flatten out rush hour and stop congestion that way. So
doesn't that punish people who can't afford the brand spanking new top-end non-emissions vehicles? That punishes the people who have to go around in older vehicles.
I think you need to set a direction of travel on emissions and encourage people to switch their cars as soon as they possibly can. But those
people are going to have to pay, and they're going to be punished for having an older car.
They pay more per mile, so they might think harder about being more efficient with their journeys, for example. So things like if you have to, I always say,
the guy in the swanky, in the all singing, all dancing latest version of Tesla, they'll pay less, even though they've got more to pay with.
They might do, but that's also, I mean,
this
rich
is perverse,
people can.
Isn't it?
can pay. Well, it's much fairer than charging people a flat fare. That's the point. And at the moment, you have to remember, we're not getting any of the current taxes that drivers pay. We don't get any of the fuel duty towards London's like streets, even repairing the potholes. We don't get the vehicle excise duty that London drivers pay. And at the moment, the government are seeking to impose this extra tax on every single person, even if they drive 1 mile. When actually you need something. You need something that does encourage people to drive less, does encourage cleaner vehicles, but you need to do it in a much fairer way. At the moment, what the government's proposing is the unfairest thing of all, and we do need to be given time to develop this thing. The thing that frustrates me is that since 2016, when I was elected to the London Assembly, I've been pushing the Mayor of London to at least develop a scheme, start consulting with people, working on things like the equalities issues you've highlighted, to see what kinds of scheme you need to design, what kind of measures you need to put in place to help people take their cars.
Yeah, one that hits the poorest hardest might not be one that's deemed all that fair. But listen, Sian Berry, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time this afternoon. Green candidate for Mayor of London, co-leader of the Green Party. Noel's in Gloucester. Afternoon, Noel.
Hiya, Tom.
Hello, mate.
Yeah, I'm interested in the experiment because it's like you've got what Labour wanted, which was the lockdown, the circuit breaker, and obviously the Conservatives have gone the other way in this country, and in 3 or 4 weeks we'll find out who's right. I mean, that's the bigger picture.
Yeah, the politics of this is now really interesting because, as you've heard on the programme, you've got Conservatives who are obviously going to town on the Labour Welsh-run Assembly for this. But also, interestingly, speaking to a Labour shadow minister on the programme earlier on, not certainly hoping that the Labour Party in Wales reflects on the measures, but not saying that it should stop them.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is about these... I mean, they've been coming on, the evils of socialism, and they're warning people about socialism, yet actually the track and trace in Wales is better, the businesses are looked after better, and these are people who are saying about the evils of socialism whilst at the same time getting a £70 breakfast on the taxpayer every morning and not feeding hungry kids.
£70. But no, the thing about the track and trace is, if it were working as much as it needs to, do you need to have a local, a national lockdown or a fire break or a circuit breaker, whatever he's calling it there?
Well, I actually think it's been put forward by the larger Labour Party as a ploy. I don't think there's anything by accident in politics like that. I think it's just been done.
I have to say, my friend, there are definitely things by accident happening in politics. It is mostly, I would say, it's 99% mess up rather than conspiracy. Thank you for your call. Jackson's in Dagenham to finish the programme this week. Hiya, Jackson.
Hello, Tom. I'm in support of the Welsh Government. Imagine I'm in the queue, or you're in the queue, and someone is in the grocer's, and they're spending their sweet little time looking for a card for their mum. And there are people in the queue wanting to go into that shop. That guy or that woman has to be kicked out because there's a long queue out here. Only shop for essentials. If you want to say Merry Christmas to you, or Merry Christmas or Happy Birthday to your mum, just ring her up. And there's a lot of silliness, and one of those people in that column is Allin-Khan. He said, bear in mind, he said in his area the rates of COVID are very low, and therefore there's no need for restrictions. What is he saying? He's waiting for the rates to go up before he brings in the restrictions when it'll be too late.
I think there is definitely the question of balance in all of this, and at what point is low enough? And this is the question that applies to certainly Boris Johnson when it comes to getting areas out of Tier 3 or Tier 2, and of course the Labour Party to explain their national circuit breaker is, at what stage do you bring out people from those kinds of restrictions? Jackson, I've got to leave it there. Yeah, listen, mate, I'm sorry I've run out of time, but thank you very much indeed for your call. Do join me Monday night, 10 p.m. here on LBC. Monday night, 10 p.m. For the late night show with Tom Swarbrick. We're back with you, Swarbrick, on Sunday from 10 a.m. next Sunday morning. Do join us at 10 p.m. on Monday if you can. It's all available on Global Player as well. You can listen back live, listen back to other programmes, and you can, of course, listen to podcasts there too. 4 p.m. here on LBC. It's Ian Payne right now. Majid Nawaz.
Thank you very much, Tom. Coming up, Michael Gove has ordered the creation of a unit to fight Scottish independence as concern grows that the government is failing to defend the union. With Brexit, COVID and economic hardship, are you worried about the future of our union? Before that, President Trump said Friday he expects Saudi Arabia to open diplomatic ties with Israel very soon, following